Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Kill Your Heroes in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 11. Scopophobia, Part 2. Sakura was in the middle of a dream where she was being slowly suffocated by a remorseless, faceless opponent when some part of her mind registered that the pressure on her chest was real. That alarmed her enough to drive her up out of sleep, eyes going wide and then narrowing as she squinted into the gray light of early dawn. She didn't have to look very hard. Pakun was right there, his rump planted solidly on her sternum, staring at her expectantly. A very strange sound, somewhere between a noise of surprise and a groan, escaped her. Jek was probably the closest phonetic equivalent. "Don't be like that, Sakura," he said. "Especially since you got to wake up to this face." This time, it was no mistaking that it was a groan, and Pakun had to scramble over her side as she rolled over onto her belly, laying still for a moment with her face buried in her pillow. The sharp immediacy of the dream was fading. Unlike some of her nightmares, it would probably be almost forgotten by the time she finished washing her face. Giving her best impression of a cat stretching, Sakura managed to escape the last grasping fingers of sleep before she tossed the covers over Pakun and stepped out of bed, where she almost tripped over Guriko, who wagged his tail without lifting his head. "How did all of you even get in here?" she asked the room at large. She'd suspected yesterday's respite wouldn't last, so she wasn't outright surprised, but she'd thought Kakashi-sensei would give her more warning. "We're ninja too, you know," Uroshi answered. "If it needs done, we'll find a way to do it." Shiba snickered. "Like letting Bossman open the door for us." Akino sighed noisily. "Some mysteries are better left unexplained," he said bitingly to Shiba, who immediately maintained that manipulating Hatake Kakashi was a trick worthy of praise. She left them to their low-voiced squabbling, instead running through her much-abbreviated morning routine. Sakura had realized on about day 2 of Kakashi-sensei's walking the dogs training that it was pointless to put much effort into getting dressed the first time, because it was all going to be a ruin after a few hours anyway. Although she hadn't submitted to the inevitable until the second week in. But now she washed her face, brushed her teeth, pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail, and made another hazardous trip back across her room to rummage in her closet without even pausing to consider lip gloss or refreshing her nail polish. She'd never thought she would see a time when she was grateful that she wouldn't see Sasuke-kun, but she'd gladly forfeit a good chunk of her mission pay if he never saw her after the Ninken had finished with her. Sakura ended up in civvies that she thought might survive the outing, a 3/4 sleeve top paired with charcoal gray capris that tucked neatly into her new boots. Seeing her dressed, her pack of escorts rose, yawning and stretching and complaining, but all their tails were wagging as they herded her toward one of the wooded training areas. Well, except Pakun, who was pretending wounded dignity. Though he unbent enough to inform her gruffly that Kakashi-sensei would meet her at the hospital later that morning, which meant that they'd have to end their session early. His promise that they'd put extra effort into the time they had seemed foreboding. And she was right. By the end of the morning, his wounded dignity had recovered and Sakura had lost almost all of hers. She'd been body-checked hard by Bull during a full-out sprint, which had sent her stumbling sideways, which would have been fine except that Shiba happened to be running there. He'd yelped, she'd tumbled, and in the end Sakura had ended up shoulder-deep in a scummy, mosquito-infested pond. So one of her arms was now smeared with mud all the way up to her elbow where she'd caught herself, and part of her shirt now reeked of eau-de stagnant pond water. She'd worried that she'd hurt Shiba, but aside from an inability to look at her without snickering, he seemed fine. On the other hand, the scar down her chest was itching. She thought it was mostly physiological. Having double-checked for remaining wigglers and nymphs among the sludge, she was really beginning to suspect they'd passed that particular pond on purpose, but that didn't stop it from ratcheting from irritating to all-consuming need as she tried to ignore it. When she couldn't take it any longer, she tugged the collar of her shirt away from it and scratched the section that ran over her collarbone very gingerly with her pinky. It was a much wider scar than the one on her face, rougher and redder, though now it only ached at the end of practice and when it was about to rain. She still turned her head to the side to avoid looking at it directly. That was her only excuse for overlooking the approaching group, because even though her muscles felt like overcooked noodles, she would have had enough energy to make a desperate flight. As it was, she flinched violently when a familiar voice called out loudly, "Sakura, is that you?" Sakura hadn't worn her shimik, because it was still so new that it would be a shame to get it dirty, but she suddenly felt very naked without it as she hastily tugged her collar back into place. But judging by the way Ino was gaping, it was too late for anything but damage control. As her eyes slid away from Ino, she discovered that Shikamaru's brows were raised incrementally, but she couldn't otherwise interpret his expression. And Asuma-sensei was openly surprised. She felt a brief flash of gratitude that Chuji had apparently been determined to finish his bag of chips before reaching the practice field, because he seemed more confused at the reactions of his teammates than anything else. Realizing that she still had her hand clenched over her shoulder, she let it drop to her side. "And who else would I be, pig?" Sakura snapped defensively. She immediately felt a little guilty when Ino bristled, but her embarrassment at having been seen overrode it. It wasn't just the scars, though those were bad enough. She was filthy and she smelled, and her future was full of mornings where she was harried by dogs and missions where she or someone else stood to die. And Ino was pretty even without artifice. She was the Yamanaka on a team tailored to make the best use of her talents, which wouldn't ever leave her stranded on a battlefield. Unfair, Sakura thought spitefully, before guilt made her flinch away from that thought. Whatever they were now, Ino had been her best friend through a very rough portion of her life. And what she'd gone through in Wave wasn't something she would wish on anyone. Her hand had crept up until she was clutching at her upper arm again, lost in her own thoughts, when she realized that Ino was peering at her with concern. She was a lot closer than she had been, probably having stomped closer to give Sakura a piece of her mind. She'd always been like that. "Sakura," Ino said slowly, "those scars." And there was the question she'd braced herself against from the moment she'd recognized the voice as Ino's. She still flinched, regardless. If it had been just the two of them, she might have answered more honestly, but even though Shikamaru and Chuji were Ino's close childhood friends, Sakura only knew them as classmates. Asuma-sensei was as good as a stranger to her. So she shrugged, the show of bravado very brittle, but it was the best she could do. "Sorry," she said curtly, "I have something I need to do." And with that flimsy excuse, she bolted. Kill your heroes. Sakura had gone home, showered and dressed with a lot more care than she had that morning, and still found herself 20 minutes earlier than Kakashi-sensei. Usually waiting on him wasn't actively annoying, as it gave her time to try and make conversation with Sasuke-kun, but being late to an actual appointment set her nerves on edge. Well, technically they weren't late yet, but Sakura had always been the type to arrive a little early, so that she never looked rushed or frazzled, and because she was the kind of student and daughter that was sensitive to adult approval. Inconveniencing hospital personnel registered to her as a very bad idea, but Kakashi-sensei arrived at the last minute and filled out the necessary paperwork with a nonchalance that made her want to shout at him. But they were in public and he was her teacher, so she didn't. It helped that the nurse was regarding him with a kind of amused, knowing tolerance. But as they were led down a hallway, all her irritation was washed away by nervous anticipation. She fidgeted with her hands as they waited atop the examination table, but luckily, or perhaps as a result of their last-minute appearance, they weren't made to wait long. The woman who slid the door open was average in height, pretty enough in the normal way of things, with long blonde hair pulled back into a low ponytail, but her smile was kind enough to put Sakura at ease. "I'm Honda Kotone and I'll be your medicnin today, Sakura-chan," she said as she entered the room. "You can call me by my first name, I don't mind. I hear you had a little bit too much excitement on your last mission. From what I see here," she glanced down at the clipboard she held in one hand, "it seems like you might be more comfortable if your sensei waited out in reception. Unless you'd prefer he stay." Sakura shook her head and Kakashi-sensei sent her a little wave as he shambled out the door, book in hand. She supposed he'd be happy enough to sit and read while he waited. She glanced back up at her medicnin, who was regarding the now closed door with the same sort of amusement the nurse had displayed. "That man," she said finally, shaking her head as she turned back to Sakura. "Well," she said, "shall we take a look?" Even if she was a medical professional and a woman besides, there was something a little awkward about taking off her shirt in front of a stranger. It would have been one thing in a public bath, but it was acutely embarrassing to have anyone stare at her when she was taking her clothes off. Even if her eyes were clearly fixed on the scar. The woman made a thoughtful noise as she drew closer, setting her clipboard aside as her hand began to glow with green chakra. Sakura was distracted from her embarrassment by the unfamiliar jutsu. They'd been taught in the academy that it was very rare for chakra to have a visible manifestation that wasn't an elemental one. Seeing her interest, the medic nin explained. This is the most basic and flexible of the medical jutsu. You can use it both as a diagnostic tool, like I'm going to now, or to heal. Sakura tried to sit very still as Koton-sensei ran her hand the length of the scar. She hummed thoughtfully, before saying, "Your doctor didn't do a bad job of it, considering she probably doesn't have a lot of experience with these sorts of injuries. A few sessions and we'll have it good as new." Sakura was surprised when her hand came up to brush across the scar at the corner of her mouth. "Same with this one." Sakura blinked, before blurting, "Kakashi-sensei said that the village wouldn't pay to have the one on my face treated. Considering that your sensei is Hatake Kakashi, I don't think he was being intentionally mean," Koton-sensei said as she pulled a wheeled stool up next to the table. "Back when it was still possible to make him sit still long enough to treat him while he's still conscious, and you have no idea how surprised I was that he actually accompanied you in here in the first place. That was the policy." Tsunade-sama's medic program was still in its early years, so there weren't as many medics, and those we did have had to focus on getting shinobi back in the field as soon as possible. There wasn't really the time or excess chakra to spare for cosmetic procedures, but nowadays Konohagakure sees the value in having shinobi that don't look like they eat small children for breakfast. "You might say it's part of our brand," she said with a laugh. "And for Kunoichi especially, we feel that there's no such thing as a cosmetic scar. If for some reason you cannot use a transformation jutsu on a mission, people find scarring on men tremendously less suspicious than on a woman. We do try to talk the shinobi into attending the additional healing sessions, but occasionally they decide a particular scar is heroic or manly and we have to leave it at that." She rolled her eyes, making her opinion of that clear. "So, to make a long story short, yes, the village will treat that scar. But while I can take care of this one starting today and have it cleared up in a few sessions, we have a specialist who does facial and burn scarring. Facial skin is especially prone to discoloration after healing, and you'll spend a lot more of your life with it uncovered than anything else, so we turn it over to someone with a really light touch. And while I'll have them make you an appointment, you probably won't get in to see her until after the exams are finished. So you'll have to live with it a little longer, all right?" As Sakura had expected to live with it for the rest of her life, it was more than all right. Kill your heroes. Her scar, already noticeably less red and raised, felt a little strange, but Sakura was in higher spirits than had been usual for her these past weeks as she trailed behind Kakashi-sensei to their normal training ground. The matter with Ino kept threatening to break her mood, but she managed to shove it aside for the moment. But there was something else on her mind, and she took the opportunity to ask Kakashi-sensei about it while they were somewhere where the boys wouldn't hear. "Kakashi-sensei. He asked without glancing over at her. Sakura might have been embarrassed to be seen with someone reading porn in public, or she would have been, if anyone had paid Kakashi-sensei any attention, but she couldn't help but be a little jealous of the awareness that let him read and walk through the busy streets of Konoha without bumping into anything or anyone. "The Chunin exams, are we going to participate in them?" She doubted it, as she was under the impression that most genin remained genin for a much longer period of time than they'd been together. But Kakashi-sensei had also allowed them to stay in wave after he'd known about Zabuza. What that said about his expectations for them scared Sakura if she thought about it too much. Kakashi-sensei made a thoughtful humming noise. "Sensei is still considering it, so you hold off on discussing it with the boys. There's a little something we need to test first." "What?" "You'll see," was his answer. Sakura battled complicated feelings about the possibility of being entered into the Chunin exams all the way to the Red Bridge that had somehow become the unofficial, waiting on Kakashi-sensei, location for Team 7. Both the boys looked surprised to see them. Naruto exclaimed. "Kakashi-sensei's kinda on time." "What is this?" Kakashi-sensei sighed theatrically. "Nothing I do ever makes you happy, does it? You sometimes make me wake up really early and then show up really late," Naruto replied with a scowl. "Ah, I do I?" Kakashi-sensei said, his tone as bland as if it would never occur to him that they'd find it irritating. "You do," Naruto confirmed, hands coming up to clutch at the air. I could still be sleeping or at least learning cool jutsu, but no, you just make me wait with this bastard, he said, thrusting both hands toward Sasuke-kun, whose own scowl deepened. Idiot, Sasuke-kun muttered, not quite under his breath. Kakashi-sensei intervened before that could start a whole new round of arguments. Ma, let's all be friendly now. There's something a little different we're going to address in training this afternoon. Naruto tilted his head to one side. You aren't talking about teaching us a new jutsu, are you? He asked skeptically. Not really, no. It's more a teamwork exercise. Do we gotta? Naruto whined. We did just fine before. Yes. Though this is primarily an exercise for Sasuke and Sakura. Sakura brightened at this news, stealing a glance at Sasuke-kun to see what he thought of it. His expression hadn't changed much from earlier, but she comforted herself with the knowledge it was Naruto he was displeased with, not her. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes turned toward her and some of the severity disappeared from his expression. There was never any need for the other members of Team 7 to demand explanations, as Naruto had the market cornered. Why the two of them? He whined and he sounded a little hurt by his exclusion. Sakura was more eager for the chance to work with Sasuke-kun than she was prepared to feel empathy for him, especially as the boys had spent most of their time in wave sparring when they hadn't been coordinating their abilities in actual battles. So far, they'd been more a team of two, with Kakashi-sensei and Sakura acting independently. But what Kakashi-sensei said next slaughtered her eagerness. Because at the core of Uchiha-style ninjutsu is the katon. And I doubt he'd be generous enough to learn to fight without it. His words might have been for Naruto, but his single eye was fixed on Sakura. It was the first time she'd ever wished that Sasuke-kun was somewhere, anywhere else than right beside her. Kill your heroes. Chapter 12. Ergophobia, Part I. Sakura stared at Kakashi-sensei, silently begging him to change his mind, but his smile was as relentless as the summer sun. Naruto was darting looks between them, obviously confused, and Sasuke-kun shifted uncomfortably, but her focus was on Kakashi-sensei. I told you that even Jounin don't like using fire, he told her conversationally. But traditionally the Uchiha haven't been among that number. Sasuke's katon techniques are extremely advanced for his age and it would be a pity to ask him to give it up, wouldn't you say? Sakura was shaking, both hands snaking up to grasp her upper arms. What's the exercise? She asked in a strangled voice. Sakura-chan. Kakashi-sensei? What the heck is going on? Naruto demanded. But he was ignored. Her fear ratcheted higher as Kakashi-sensei formed familiar hand seals, slow enough for her to follow them easily. At his side, three ferocious, sneering shinobi materialized and her throat seized tight, her hands dropping instinctively to her kunao pouch though she knew they were illusory. Sasuke was faster, his hands running through a series of seals so quickly she couldn't follow them, but when they slammed together in the final tiger seal, she knew what was coming. He inhaled deeply, his eyes dark and focused, and when he exhaled, an enormous writhing sun in miniature roared into existence before it spun forward in an inevitable collision course with the enemy nin. She recognized the katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. She also recognized that if the enemy nin were quick, they could have avoided the technique, which was predictable in its path and only as quick in its travel as a well-thrown kunao. But they didn't. Some part of her knew that it was only genjutsu, not even a particularly subtle one, but her memory supplied the stink of it, the sound of it, and she could only watch them burn in mute horror. And the Sasuke-kun in the illusion was not nearly as affected as she was. He looked to her, satisfied as a cat having caught a mouse, and fire gleamed in his dark eyes. She did scream when someone grabbed her arms hard enough to bruise, their nails digging into her skin. Stop it, Kakashi! Sasuke demanded, though the strength of his grip had already broken the illusion. Whatever you're showing her, stop. Kakashi-sensei's voice was even in response, though as Sakura had wrenched herself away from Sasuke-kun and sunk into a crouch, hands clutching at her head as she tried desperately to shove the image away, he could have been shouting and she would have hardly cared. She kept seeing the illusory Sasuke-kun's smirk of triumph, something so familiar from dozens of taijutsu bouts at the academy, so strange and different when partnered with the scene the genjutsu had shown her. I'm not doing it out of cruelty. There's going to come a point in your career when she's going to have to come to terms with your ninjutsu. Better here and now, without real enemies to take advantage of her distraction, rather than later. Though I have faith in Sakura's ability to work through fear in live combat. Sakura was unmoved by the compliment, because she didn't find much admirable in a determination not to die, nor was she enjoying this particular moment enough to have room for much vanity. Sakura. She jerked away from Sasuke-kun's reaching hand, taking deep, gasping breaths. Fine, she said tightly. I'm fine. A smile was beyond her, but she repeated the mantra once more. I'm fine. Sasuke-kun frowned at her, but she didn't think he'd contradict her. No, he said, to her surprise. You're not. But I don't think what Kakashi did helped. What was the point of that? He demanded of Kakashi-sensei. The point is this, after seeing that, how well can the two of you cooperate with each other? How much do you really trust one another? With you and Naruto, you've sparred and argued, but you're still able to work together effectively when it really counts. Are you and Sakura capable of the same thing? Sasuke-kun looked like he wanted to make a harsh retort, but as he glanced over at Sakura, he subsided. What do you want us to do? He asked gruffly instead. Sakura, you're right-handed, and Sasuke favors his left if given a choice, so let's do this. Hold hands. What? Sasuke-kun asked sharply. Why should we? Go on, Kakashi-sensei urged. Sasuke-kun's put upon sigh was an indication of his surrender, but Sakura felt no giddy excitement as he caught her hand in his own. His own palm was warm and dry, hers clammy. She found it embarrassing, but mostly it was just uncomfortable, as some part of her acknowledged that this should be something she enjoyed, while the rest of her worked to keep from pulling away. Was her attraction to him really so weak as to falter when confronted with an image of him setting people on fire? She'd known he was fire-natured. She'd heard about the Uchiha ninjutsu, seen him use it. But she'd failed to acknowledge what that meant. So the fluttering of her heart when Kakashi-sensei bound their hands together with a strip of dark cloth had everything to do with feeling trapped, rather than titillated. The exercise is simple. Or it would be, if you were working alone or could coordinate your movements well. We've done part of this one before, Sakura. I'm going to give you a destination. The two of you will have to work together to get there without dying. If I get in a clean hit with these, he walked over to the posts that he'd once tied Naruto to and hoisted a bag, you're dead and you'll come back here and try again. Die 5 times and you'll fail the exercise. What are these? Sasuke-kun asked suspiciously. This time it's rubber balls coated in red chalk, Kakashi-sensei replied cheerfully. Don't worry. They'll leave some nasty bruises, but they probably won't break anything. Rules well, I don't have to tell you no ninjutsu. No weapons. The goal is to dodge, not deflect. Any questions? No? Then, you're aiming for the northeast border of the training ground, where there's a split elm with a pink ribbon tied to one trunk and a blue ribbon tied to the other. When you've got both ribbons, you'll be safe. In theory, it wasn't very different from the exercises she'd run in the mornings on Wave. In practice, it was a different beast entirely. Sakura had several weeks of training in escaping multiple pursuers, in anticipating the points at which Kakashi-sensei would choose to attack, and in tracking a course while in full flight. Her stamina and her ability to dodge was more honed than it had ever been. And Sasuke-kun was, well, Sasuke-kun. It should have been easy. It wasn't. They died twice in quick succession, neither time precisely the fault of one or the other, but simply because they were working at odds rather than together. Once while they were still attempting to adjust to running together even though they were almost the same height, stride length had been less of a problem than Sakura's instinct to settle into the pace she'd learned she could maintain and Sasuke's desire to press them into a slightly faster one, and then because they tried to dodge in different directions, which had resulting in some stumbling that might have been funny if she'd been the one watching. As it was, her shoulder was still a little sore. This isn't working, Sasuke-kun muttered as he pulled them both in behind the shelter of a massive tree. We'll have to call it, or something, whenever we notice Kakashi. Sakura wasn't used to such uncertainty from Sasuke-kun, but she nodded without really looking over at him. She knew she wasn't really helping, keeping more space between than she usually would, but every time she drew close, she thought she smelled smoke. Whether it was real or a product of her overactive imagination, it didn't matter. It was just making the exercise more difficult. So she left Sasuke-kun to lead, but even though he was taking this very seriously now, his Sharingan activated, and Sakura was using her time with Kakashi-sensei to maximize her own usefulness. He wasn't actually trying to kill them, after all, so he almost always broadcast his location in a way they'd notice if they were paying attention. But though they made it farther than any other attempt, Sasuke-kun ended up with another red splotch smeared across his shirt. "I'm not deaf, you know," Kakashi-sensei called down dryly from his position in the trees. Sasuke-kun scowled up at him and they trudged back to the starting point in silence. If it had been before Wave, Sakura had little doubt she probably would have been exhausted by this point. The distance he'd assigned them for their course wasn't insignificant and, if you compiled their attempts, they'd more than run it once already. But now, she'd only worked past the first wall of discomfort, and she was ready for their next attempt. She finally snuck a glance over at Sasuke-kun, easily reading his frustration, then down at their linked hands. What if? She made herself sidle closer to Sasuke-kun, who immediately noticed the lack of distance, his eyes turning toward her though he didn't move his head. "This is just a suggestion, but," she said in a low voice, "what if we use pressure? What if we shift our hands so our fingers are interlaced? That would be 5 points of contact. What if we assigned a direction to each finger? Like, forward for the index finger, back for the pinky, left for the middle finger, right for the ring finger, and down for the thumb." Sasuke-kun was quiet for so long she was beginning to think he disliked the idea and would prefer to pretend they weren't holding hands at all. "That might work," he breathed at last. "Practice on the way back." And he shifted his hand so that her fingers were laced with hers. Her heart seemed to skip a beat, and it wasn't entirely because the boy she liked was holding her hand in a way that felt much more personal than the passive grip they'd had before. It was also because Uchiha Sasuke, best shinobi of their graduating class, had agreed to her plan. And because that scent wasn't only in her imagination. Sasuke-kun did smell faintly of smoke. She shoved it aside, concentrating instead on cooperating with Sasuke-kun, because it would be embarrassing if she was the one to mistake the directions, given that she'd been the one to assign them. This time, when Kakashi-sensei gave them the signal, they moved off in almost perfect unison. Sasuke-kun seemed a little surprised when she began augmenting her own speed with chakra now that they were on their second-to-last life, matching the pace he'd been trying to set earlier, but he fell in readily enough. And her pressure system worked, their determination making them both hyper-attentive to the signals being sent by the other. It wasn't pretty, nothing like what either of them would have been able to manage on their own, but it was functional. It got them to the elm. And it won them their blue ribbon. But Sakura knew all about last-second ambushes and Kakashi-sensei. The moment she met Sasuke-kun's eyes, bright with triumph and dark as night, she knew what was about to happen. No. He'd already ripped the ribbon free, revealing the paper seal that had been cleverly disguised beneath it. It activated, triggering nearby traps that had been hidden so thoroughly that he hadn't spotted them with his Sharingan. And without it, he didn't have the reaction time to keep from being hit. But Sakura had moved almost before she'd choked out her abbreviated warning. She chose to ignore that his look of self-satisfaction, of self-assured triumph, was a mirror of the one Kakashi-sensei had shown them in the Genjutsu. One day, that might be real. And she would deal with it then, would have to decide whether she'd been more horrified at the act itself or that she'd done it, or if the lingering trauma was caused by some mixture of those factors and other things. But today was not that day. Today, Sasuke-kun was her teammate. Their bound hands made it awkward to do anything but throw herself forward, wrapping her free hand tightly around Sasuke-kun's torso. She used everything she'd learned about chakra manipulation, shoving them away from the tree so quickly the world became streaks of color, one dark splotch that made her tighten her grip, almost certainly Kakashi-sensei. She'd thrown them up in an arc that would land her feet first on the other elm trunk, but she was entirely vulnerable in midair. And when her feet smacked solidly down on the other trunk without either of them being bludgeoned, she understood that this was what Kakashi-sensei had wanted. They hadn't won. They were being allowed to pass the test. She snatched up the ribbon regardless, flinging them out of the way of another round of traps. Maybe one improbable day, she'd be good enough to win outright against Kakashi-sensei. But for now, she'd take his approval. Provided, she thought with dismay, seeing how quickly Sasuke-kun was to put her at arm's length. Sasuke-kun was still speaking to her after she'd effectively manhandled him. Kill your heroes. Sakura had an audience as she stood in front of the mirror, wearing all the pieces of her new outfit together for the first time. She'd made good progress on breaking in her boots, but she'd buffed them back to a dress shine to get the full effect. Her overskirt was shorter and of significantly less fabric than her dress had been, a shade of purple-tinted pink that made the panels look almost like the squared petals of a flower. Her dresses had been cut down into sleeveless vests and she wore her shimik, which she'd finally become adept at tying. Her hair had been swept back out of the way into a loose, low ponytail, her forehead protector still in its usual place at the top of her head. And, as Hasakura-san had promised, her knives sat comfortably flush on the outside of her thighs, with built-in storage for her kunao and shuriken. He'd worked some light padding into the panels that sat against her leg, for long-term wear comfort, and as it was a full rig, he'd explained that it would be easy to add and remove attachments as needed at her belt line. It made her feel very much an adult. Normally that would a very good, empowering kind of thing. But at this moment, in these circumstances, she was uncertain that an adult was something she wanted to be. Tomorrow was the registration deadline for the Chunin exams. Which meant today was Kakashi-sensei's last chance to announce to the boys that they were taking the test, if he'd decided they were ready. Her fingers stretched out, as if to brush against the mirror, but she drew them back before she left fingerprints. So, what do you think? She asked her audience, turning to face them. Tails wagged in a kind of quiet applause, though as Guriko's eyes were closed, she didn't know how genuine all of it was. She was struck by a sudden nostalgia for her friendship with Ino. The first time she'd worn her new Kippeo dress, it had been Ino sitting on her bed, applauding her modeling. She liked the Ninken, strange as that was after what they put her through on a regular basis, but it just wasn't the same. So, with a sigh, she took their compliments as the best she was going to get and let herself and the pack out of the house. They soon wandered off, to do whatever it was they intended to do for the day, and Sakura did the same. Without an appointment to meet up with Team 7 until much later and with her rivalry with Ino leaving a gaping hole in her time where their friendship had been, Sakura just sort of drifted. She window shopped for a while, but just looking wasn't as much fun on her own, and it was too early to eat, so she was actually sort of grateful when she heard a familiar voice. Though when she discovered Naruto playing ninja with academy students, she didn't know whether that was the proper emotional response. And the implication that she was his girlfriend was entirely uncalled for. She would have let it pass by, because she was a genin now and genin didn't get into fights with academy students, but when Naruto blushed, scratched at the back of his neck, and said, "You think so?" that was entirely too much. Him she could smack upside the head. A sharp glance at the others was enough to send them running, which wasn't a bad thing until the loudest and noisiest of the bunch slammed into someone else. And that someone else was wearing a forehead protector with a symbol she'd only seen in textbooks. He was also very uncharitable about the whole thing, which she could understand, to an extent. Not quite to the extent where it was acceptable to hoist Kano Amaru into the air like that, though. Naruto was widening his stance and clearly threatening to escalate the situation with his body language, even if he hadn't said anything beyond his demand the stranger put Kano Amaru down. Sakura, however, did not want the situation to become any worse than it already was, especially as she had a good idea why soon a ninja would be allowed to wander the streets freely. Inter-village incidents were bad, regardless of which village it was with. So she bowed instead. "I'm very sorry," she apologized, her sincerity increased by her nervousness. Because while they were probably genin candidates for the exam, both of them were older than Naruto and her. But the older boy wasn't prepared to be appeased so easily. While he was sneering at them, Sakura was searching for the right words to fix the situation, being careful to keep her hands clear of her knives. Because once weapons came into play, or even anything like real violence, it would be very, very difficult to get anyone to willingly back down. Well, at least that was her experience with Naruto and Sasuke-kun. She'd be more than willing to solve things with words. But Sasuke-kun intervened before she could think of anything. And, just as she'd thought, the stranger was ready to meet Sasuke's rock with something else, though, luckily, she never discovered what it was. As a third stranger, this one a younger redhead, joined the others, she had a moment's doubt whether it was really lucky. Because when he clearly controlled his teammates through fear, she didn't want to know what he'd be like if they met him in the exams. But she bit her lip and didn't interfere as he demanded Sasuke-kun's name, and Sasuke-kun received in return the name of Suna no Gara. Let Naruto demand their attention. She would be happy if those intense, unsettling green eyes never fixed on her. No one said a word about her new outfit. Kill your heroes. Sakura hung back as the boys demanded answers from Kakashi-sensei. And if it was dismay she felt at the affirmative answer, she tried to hide it well. Because, after all they'd gone through together, she didn't want to be the one holding their team back. Naruto would whine, which she'd find irritating but bearable, but after their teamwork exercise and perhaps before that, she couldn't bear to disappoint Sasuke-kun. And he was clearly intent on their participation. So she swallowed down her own reservations. And if she waited until the next morning to fill out the paperwork, choosing instead to spend her evening obsessively checking her equipment and then spending several hours pressed into the corner of her room, the blanket from her bed draped around her shoulders as she tried to reason through what tomorrow would bring, there was no one else home to know. By the time she woke up the next morning, she'd regained some composure and perspective. It was only a test, designed to measure their suitability for promotion. Their mission in Wave had been an aberration, one she shouldn't use as a measure for what was actually expected of them at this point in their career. She'd convinced herself that it would be much closer to their academy exercises than the kind of action they'd seen on the bridge. The conditions, after all, would be controlled and the entrance would be monitored, and it wouldn't make much sense to lose genin during the exam. Especially the genin that belonged to foreign villages, like the Sunanin they'd run into yesterday. She could imagine that might become a major point of contention, if it was all that common for their shinobi to die while within the walls of other villages. And, upon consideration, when she'd told her parents about Kakashi-sensei's bell test, they'd told her stories about their own graduation exams. Her parents were Chunin, and if the exam was really so awful, she thought that would have been the moment for them to mention it. And most of the ninja in the village were Chunin, even those that held non-combat positions. So it had to be something that even those shinobi destined to work in the code-breaking office or in the aviary, like her mother, could pass. So it wasn't confidence that they would necessarily win promotion that accompanied her out the door, but confidence about the nature of the exam. Regardless of what had happened after her graduation, she still remembered what it was like to do well at the academy. If they asked her to do something like that, she had faith enough in her own skills to not be the one who held the team back. And, judging by the expressions and body language of her teammates, both of them shared that opinion. At first, nothing occurred to shake Sakura's certainty. Even if she'd been so unobservant as to miss the fact that the ground floor had been clearly labeled and they hadn't climbed enough flights to make it to the third floor, she'd sensed the use of genjutsu almost before she cleared the stairs. The written exam that followed that bolstered her confidence magnificently, because while she found the questions challenging, they weren't so difficult as to cause her to think she'd gotten any wrong. And if being told that none of that mattered at all, so long as they opted to stay in the exam as so dramatically evidenced by Naruto, tore at her pride, it was nothing to what happened next. The Forest of the Death was bad enough on its own. But what found them there changed them forever. Kill your heroes. Chapter 13. Ergophobia, Part 2. Sakura had seen flesh bubble and melt like wax beneath fire before, but she'd never, not even in the wild dreams that followed her first real battle, imagined that someone could just peel it away, like the damaged skin of an orange. It was strangely fascinating, like most truly horrific things were, and she couldn't have looked away even if she hadn't been so acutely aware it was a bad idea. Sakura knew with utmost certainty she'd revisit this scene in nightmares for years to come. It had begun with a wind. She was beginning to suspect that there would come a point in her life where she wouldn't trust any breeze strong enough to raise a cloud of dust or a whirl of leaves without strong evidence that the whole forest was affected, but as this had been a localized event strong enough to raise a path clear of grass and small rocks, she'd been absolutely certain that it was on purpose. At the first strong gust, she'd immediately taken cover. She'd noted Sasuke-kun, stretched belly down in the cover of brush, but she'd felt the sting of Ryo-sized rocks and had retreated behind the root of one of the behemoth trees that populated the entire forest. Before they'd been allowed to enter the Forest of Death, she'd been under the impression that the area was a forested mountain. She'd had no idea that the swell on the horizon was owed not to dirt and rock, but to trees whose branches you could hold an academy drill practice on. So it wasn't so much a root she sheltered behind so much as a thick wooden wall, albeit one with a heavy layer of moss growing on it. It was only when she heard the wind die down that she scurried up the side of her shelter and peeked over, careful to keep close to the tree and minimize her profile. Where they'd been standing only moments ago looked like a blade had sheared a path down the center of the clearing, and she was doubly glad of the protection and vantage the huge moss-covered tree offered. But even from her new height, she couldn't see Naruto. She hadn't thought the wind had been that strong, but the woods were very dense, which was part of what made navigating them so difficult. It was possible he was somewhere close by, her view simply obstructed. If nothing else, she'd learned to respect his durability. He had a fool's luck and she had to trust that meant that he hadn't been seriously injured. Sakura thought for a moment her belief was confirmed as Naruto came out of the settling dust, but she stayed where she was. They were taught henge in the academy not only because it was a useful jutsu, but also because it was very difficult to detect even by high-level ninja. And she'd lost track of Naruto entirely in the brief chaos. She thought it was Naruto, but she also thought it was suspicious that someone would waste the chakra on such an impressive ninjutsu without attempting to remove at least one of them from the field of battle. Testing for Chunin or not, no one in this forest should have the kind of chakra to use it so frivolously. It could just be an idiot showing off, but she thought there wasn't any harm in letting Sasuke-kun be the one to confront Naruto. If she thought she could circle around behind without being noticed, she might have tried, but she had less than perfect confidence in her abilities. That was in no little part due to certain ninkin, who were either going to give a complex or make her the greatest ninja who ever spent her childhood being literally hounded. So Sakura stayed where she was, muscles tense, while Sasuke called out a challenge. And she was surprised at how quickly Sasuke-kun determined Naruto was a fake, flinging a kunao at him. It was the way he dodged that decided her, not his knowledge of the password. The phrase wasn't long and almost rhymed, and they'd spent a long time honing their memory at the academy, or at least the kunoichi classes had, so she'd thought Naruto was finally buckling down enough to memorize it seriously. How could he expect to receive and carry messages so confidential they couldn't be written down otherwise? Or even recall complex directions without consulting an incriminating map? She'd had an instant's thought it might have made up, at least a little, for how he'd made it through the first portion on sheer bravado. Apparently Sasuke didn't share her opinion. And that was a good thing. "You're a clever one," not Naruto drawled. "Why don't you ask your friend to come out from where she's lurking? I wonder if you'd accuse her of the same thing. Are you burdened by dimwits or is this one just a special case? Come on out, Sakura," Sasuke-kun commanded. Sakura did as she was told, sidling closer to Sasuke, who demanded the password from her without ever looking at her. And she, of course, recited it effortlessly back at him. "And that isn't suspicious?" the stranger wearing Naruto's face asked. "No. It'd be suspicious if Sakura couldn't recall the password word for word." "Naruto's too much of an idiot to manage it," Sasuke-kun replied, not hiding his disdain for both the stranger and his teammate. In his case, it wasn't so much a password as a trap for anyone who might be eavesdropping. "And you stumbled right into it." Sakura wanted to allow this pre-match gloating to lull her into the same sense of fighting for points that she'd enjoyed at the academy, but the dank, heavy atmosphere of the forest and the blatant aggression of the foreign shinobi that they'd shared the waiting room with kept her on edge. As did the thought that they'd all registered in teams of 3, one of theirs was missing, and they had no idea where the stranger's teammates were. Sakura did not want to find herself the victim of being outflanked, whether the stranger was playing for points or blood. All her battles thus far had been won because she'd managed to face every opponent one-on-one. The one time she'd tried for more, on the deck of Gato's yacht, she'd almost gotten herself killed. So she let Sasuke-kun handle the conversation. "I'm impressed. You haven't dropped your guard at all, have you?" the stranger said, Naruto's image wavering and fading. Sakura was struck first by just how ugly the woman who replaced him was. Her skin was sallow, her eyes had dark bruising beneath them, and her lips were so thin as to be practically non-existent. And she hadn't tried to correct any of it with cosmetics. But worse than that was what she wore. Sakura wouldn't have guessed there was a woman on the planet who'd emphasize an already non-existent waist with a thick rope tied in a strange sort of bow. Combined with the drab, unflattering clothing, if it hadn't been for the feminine mode of speech, Sakura would have guessed man before woman. And an unfashionable one at that. Civilian women could get away with doing what they liked concerning their looks, but kunoichi were trained well before puberty how to flatter and enhance their assets. That was one course she was almost certain the boys had no equivalent for. She couldn't imagine Sasuke-kun sitting through lectures and practical exercises on the production almost like it was a play, with props, and costumes and lines, the markers that differentiated docile housewife from whore and everything in between of masculinity, as she had femininity. Though, there was no law anywhere that said a man couldn't use feminine speech. And, man or woman, it didn't matter. Kunao killed, no matter what hands wielded them. The stranger had been talking as she wrestled with the irrelevant matter of gender and she'd listened to the words, even if she hadn't been focusing on them. This promises to be very entertaining. Making an elaborate production out of drawing her own scroll out of a pouch, the Kusanin made certain they got a good look at the companion character to their own heaven scroll. You'd love to get your hands on our earth scroll, wouldn't you? She taunted, before she did something that almost made Sakura gag. She swallowed it whole. Disgusted, Sakura added at least minor body manipulation to the list of the shinobi's skills. Strange as it was, Sakura wished they'd stop drawing this out. It wasn't like the situation with the Sunanin. There wasn't going to be any apologies and everyone going their own way. This was just scraping her nerves raw, making her so jumpy that it was going to go beyond honing her reflexes and make her clumsy instead. Once, she remembered being good at this kind of psychological warfare. Not as good as Ino, but then again, no one was. It was a dim, faraway memory now. But she didn't have the courage to be the one who struck the first blow, so she stayed quiet, willing to follow Sasuke-kun's lead. And, judging by his expression, he was almost as eager to begin the battle as she was, though their reasons were probably very different. That was when the world went wrong. She thought she remembered killing intent. She'd thought Zabuza was as bad as it could get. She'd been wrong. Sakura had only caught the edge of Zabuza's killing intent. All those times Kakashi-sensei had driven fear into her mind, it was a needle thrusting and this was a wedge driven by a sledgehammer. It tore her open like a rotten stump, exposed all her weaknesses, her insecurities, and ripped her apart with a vivid, immersive vision of her own death. The whole world seemed to be washed in shades of crimson pain. She hadn't realized she'd collapsed to her knees, but she found herself there, trembling violently. It was like those earliest nightmares, where her fear was so great it was a kind of paralysis. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just sit and shiver, her breathing quick and gasping, the kind that led to fainting. It was Sasuke's violent retching that brought her back to herself. She was always alone in the nightmares. Always. Or as alone as a relentless enemy and encroaching death would ever let her be. The paralysis of terror wasn't the only thing that followed her into waking. More than that came the chase. She'd run and run and run until daylight broke the cycle and even then not escape that restless need. If their enemy had taken a single step forward, had drawn a kunao, she would have bolted. Bolted without a single thought for Sasuke-kun or Naruto or anything else. It was that kind of overwhelming. But as she watched Sasuke-kun struggle to pull himself into an unbalanced half-crouch, she realized she couldn't run, not like that. Because she had never seen this expression on him before, his wild, desperate eyes not focusing on his opponent, but seeking her out. Beyond the crushing pressure of the fear of her own death, something tugged at her heart. Sasuke-kun. What she couldn't know was that Sasuke, in his relentless pursuit of perfection, had created for himself an unexpected weakness. He'd built himself up to never run, and because the fear was too great to advance, he could only stand there and quiver. But she'd been here before. It was not a comfortable place, it was not a pretty one, it was not the one she wanted to live in, but she'd died dozens of deaths in dreams. In fire, in water, in pain that had lasted longer than the brief, harsh death of a kunao driven deep. She was getting a little light-headed from her breathing, but she didn't slow it. She knew she needed a plan. Needed to do something more than attack or run blindly. But her cleverness was failing her, stymied by a wall of skill. She could not attack and hope to win, but she didn't know if just running would be enough. Not when their opponent could use abilities like this without any sign of preparation or strain. Whatever this Kusunin was, she wasn't a Chunin exam candidate. Inaction was also death, and between going forward and falling back, she would choose retreat. Choice alone wasn't enough, but unless Sasuke-kun came to himself quickly, it might have to be. She didn't think she could carry Sasuke-kun fast enough to escape, not without something to keep the enemy nin busy. And she doubted her genjutsu would cause this one to do more than blink. She was drawn from her desperate, fruitless planning by Sasuke's slow struggle to draw a kunao and straighten into something like his usual stance. She'd never seen him fight so hard to achieve so little. Very good, the woman praised him. What happens now? Sakura watched their enemy draw two kunao, holding them tauntingly loose by the loops. Don't worry, I'll make it quick. But I don't have to tell you that, do I? You've seen it with your own eyes. But I must say, how disappointing. Sakura saw the enemy draw her arm back. Saw Sasuke-kun, still held firmly in the grip of his fear. And all her half-formed plans, so painfully reasoned through the press of terror smothering her, vanished. Her hand darted to her kunao pouch, her wrist snapping out in a perfect release while her legs drove her to the side from where she'd crouched, her shoulder coming up beneath Sasuke-kun's ribs hard enough for a pained wheeze to escape, but she dug her fingers into the back of his shirt and straightened enough to fling herself forward into a sprint. So the prey isn't so defenseless, after all, her opponent called after them, the sound of metal against metal telling her she'd parried her kunao. She didn't stop to make conversation, just ran, using chakra and the odd, slanted trunks to take great hurtling leaps. Sakura's back was tense with the anticipation of a kunao thrown in return, but none came. It wasn't luck, she didn't think when she had room to think about anything but angle and output and Kami-sama, what do I do if, but it was part of the same reason that Shinobi had stopped to make conversation before attacking. Whatever she wanted to do it face to face. She didn't retreat too far, part of her aware that Naruto was somewhere, that ninja had done something to him, the other reason being that she couldn't outrun their enemy with Sasuke-kun bouncing against her shoulder like a sack of rice. Sakura expected him to angrily shove away when she crouched down, expected him to assume that extra edge of gruffness that he used to cover his very rare embarrassment, but he just sort of slumped to the ground, eyes still too wide and too wild to even pretend at composure. He was more mobile than he had been, the pain of her bony shoulder jabbing him in the ribs may be enough to loose the hold of the genjutsu, but he wasn't free of it. Probably because it wasn't entirely a genjutsu, Sakura thought as she hovered worriedly. Their opponent was simply that terrifying. Sasuke, he slapped a hand against her mouth before she could say anything more, his grasp on his kunao tightening. We have to get out of here, he whispered desperately. We have to move. That was what he said, but he didn't rise to lead the way as he always had before. She caught a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision and she felt her own eyes widen as she took in the sheer scope of the creature staring unblinking back at her with silent menace. She'd been in survival class mode since they'd passed beneath the first branches of the Forest of Death, so her mind provided information without conscious effort. So beyond the immediate, "Oh Kami-sama, that's a giant snake," there was a stream of information. They lived in a forested, temperate climate. Snakes were a fact of her life and Sakura hadn't thought she'd had any particular fear of them. But, then again, she'd never met one whose head was almost as large as her bedroom. As she ducked away from Sasuke-kun's hand, she registered, non-native, judging by the shape of the head, non-venomous, likely constrictor type, but that was all she had time for as she leapt and the snake struck at her with blinding speed. Its teeth were matched rows of backwards curved white pillars that led down into the darkness of its throat, 2 rows on the lower jaw, and 4 along the roof of its mouth. And as that mouth closed around her, the thought that she'd guessed correctly about it being a constrictor wasn't any kind of comfort. But she didn't have time for self-congratulation or regret. She'd drawn kunao as she jumped from the tree and now she used them to anchor herself against the forward momentum that would have had her in the back of its throat. She drove them deep into the roof of its mouth, swinging her feet up so that she could latch onto the ridged ceiling with chakra. which worked for the moment before it registered the pain, and then she was a rock being shaken in a wooden box, except this box had nails driven in it with the pointed ends exposed and the rock was flimsy and fleshy. It was whipping its head about violently, trying to dislodge her, its size actually a hindrance because she was too small to be forced down its maw by the powerful muscles in its throat. She tried to hold herself in place, but while her arms and legs were safely away from teeth, she wasn't strong enough to hold her core completely steady. Her shirt caught on the tip of one, and in her distraction, the next sudden shift saw more than fabric caught. She swallowed a shriek and stifled the instant urge to rip away, closing her eyes so that she could pretend she wasn't in something's mouth, and waited for the right moment. It came when the snake threw back its head, nearly 2/3 of its massive body rocketing upward, perfectly perpendicular to the ground. Sakura let go, and for a moment she was in terrifying freefall, her back to the waiting throat and with no good way to judge distance in the dark, but for just a moment the jaws opened, sunlight spilled in, and she drove in a second set of kunao. This time she was far enough back that she only need to worry about the teeth if the snake dropped its head and she fell forward, but she'd had enough of this. It wasn't nearly as damp as she would have thought, but there was an unnerving smell and her side was warm and sticky and aching. She shoved off from the roof and landed awkwardly across the presently vertical space at the base of the mouth, just at the back of the tongue. She'd lost her footing and had to channel chakra through her hip instead, but she was sprawled next to her target area and that would have to be good enough. Sakura had tried to remember if she'd been taught anything of snake anatomy, but all she could remember at the moment were irrelevant facts about organ size increase during digestion, and it wouldn't help at all if its heart could expand up to 40% with a large meal. But the brain was protected by bone, the spine by flesh and distance, so that left the front of the throat. This time, she unsheathed one her knives, longer and better suited for cutting than any kunao. She flipped it so that the curve was angled as if she had a fang of her own, and with all her weight and chakra, both hands firm on the hilt, she plunged it down and then tore them through the flesh like she was trying to plow a field. Blood spurted up, soaking her hands, her front, her face, but she only redug the trench, the unprotected flesh parting gratifyingly beneath her well-sharpened blade. She worked with frantic energy, and because she was no longer dangling, its struggling became less painful and more simply the sensation she'd left her stomach some 20 feet behind. Then she saw daylight and she followed it, using her knife and her free hand to part the way, slithering free of the writhing mass of snake like some particularly monstrous birth. She hoped it was residual nerve function, but even it wasn't. Animals weren't like humans. In the face of devastating injury, they would back down and flee. Standing unsteadily, she was surprised to glimpse Sasuke-kun. Her sense of time and distance, constrained by the dark interior of a snake's mouth, had made the brief struggle last much longer and cover much more distance than it had. Her breathing settling a little from its ragged pace, she leaped back up the trunk to rejoin him, and it wasn't until she went to sweep her bangs away from where they were sticking to her cheeks that she fully realized just how covered in gore she was, her knife still clenched in one hand in a white-knuckled grip. So it was that she thought Sasuke-kun's look was for her, but when he gritted out, behind, she turned to see something bubbling up out of the snake's head. Their fight wasn't nearly finished yet. Kill your heroes. Chapter 14. Ergophobia, Part 3. Like some sort of terrible warble, the snake's skin swelled and parted to reveal the Kusunin, who didn't look at all upset at the turn of events. Sakura couldn't say the same. Because she'd really hoped that the enormous snake, while she hadn't recognized it as a native species, had simply happened to live in these behemoth, oversized trees. That it hadn't been a summoned animal. Because that meant they had no chance at all. Though she'd been sweaty and warm from her struggle inside the snake, Sakura felt a chill sweep through her. I don't want to die. Not for a Chunin exam, not at the hands of this Kusunin, not before she had her first kiss, went on her first date, or any of the 100 other things, normal, stupid things she was supposed to be able to do before she died. Her grip on her knife was so tight that her fingers tingled from lack of circulation, and she eased her grip a little. No ninja lived forever, but she'd thought she would die for a better reason than this strange encounter. The Kusunin had never even made clear what it was she wanted. And she certainly hadn't thought she'd die in one of Konohagakure's practice fields. Where were the proctors who were supposed to be monitoring this exam? She thought with a deep sense of abandonment and betrayal. How can she just summon something like that here and no one sense a thing? Surely they could have enlisted the Hyuga clan to help keep track of the candidates in the forest, if for no other reason than to make certain that the foreign nin didn't leave the zone and attempt to infiltrate the village proper. This was the bridge all over again. Even Sasuke-kun, as he was now, provided her with no feeling of reassurance that everything was alright, that things would be taken care of as they should be. At least Sasuke-kun didn't look as stiff as he had earlier. He didn't look normal by any stretch of the imagination, but she thought she could trust that he would at least move if the Kusanin attacked. I sense your fear and desperation, the woman below them crooned. The prey must never let down its guard, not even for a moment, in the presence of its predator. Although your friend's little fangs are unexpectedly sharp, mine are sharper. And then she was coming towards them and Sakura upgraded minor body manipulation to major body manipulation, because she slithered up toward them fast and agile as a real snake, her whole body flexing to conform to the shape of the tree. Sakura crouched, shifting her grip on her knife and leaving her other hand free for now, trying for some flash of inspiration that would allow her to use the environment against her opponent. None came, but Naruto did. Sakura was just a little bit relieved, but Sasuke-kun obviously felt that he was just one more person coming to die. And when the Kusanin agreed, that was enough to set Naruto off. You've been picking on my friends and I don't like that, he declared, as if they were 6 and on academy grounds rather than standing over the cooling corpse of one of the largest summoned animals Sakura had ever even heard of. Slither on back into your hole, snake lady. Sakura hadn't even noticed that Sasuke-kun's Sharingan was activated until his eyes faded to black. Reaching into his pouch, he withdrew their scroll, turning it so that the heaven character was clearly displayed. Here, he offered, his voice steady and determined, you can have it. Say what? Naruto shouted indignantly. No way, we're just going to hand the scroll over to the enemy. What's wrong with you? Stay out of it. Sasuke-kun snarled at Naruto without so much as glancing at him. Very wise, very sensible, the Kusanin said, reaching out a hand as Sasuke-kun threw the scroll in a lazy arc. An arc that was intercepted by Naruto, who shoved the scroll forcefully into his own pouch and turned to glare at Sasuke-kun. He turned his back on the Kusanin as he stalked toward them on the branch. Stop playing the damn hero, Sasuke-kun growled, just stay out of it and leave it to me. Naruto's response to that was to punch him full in the face and Sasuke-kun stumbled back. You idiot, Sasuke-kun hissed, you don't know what you're doing. Naruto was breathing heavily, from emotion rather than exhaustion, and he yelled back, I may not know the password, but I know who I am. You're the one I'm not so sure about. How do we know you're who you say you are? Surrendering, giving up the scroll, when did Sasuke become a coward? You keep saying I don't understand what's going on, but I do. You've choked, that's what it is. Sakura had never wanted to hit Naruto so much in her life. If she smacked him atop the head now, he'd go face first down against the tree and he'd do it so hard he'd bounce, she was that mad. She could have shook him until his teeth rattled, because did he think that sheer determination was all it took? If that was it, no one would ever die. She was so angry that she wanted to let him face the snake alone when the Kusanin summoned another one, because he'd created an impossible situation. If he refused to retreat, unless they abandoned him, none of them were going to escape. Kakashi-sensei, there should be a subclause that exempts us from being trash when it involves idiots who are going to get all of us killed. Get a clue, Naruto? She barked as she dashed past him, his eyes widening incrementally as he took in her appearance. This exam isn't worth dying for. I won't die for your pride or a stupid scroll or so that you can be the big damn hero. Whether she looks like an Okama or not, she's not someone you can beat just by getting up again when you're knocked down. This time there was still branch beneath her as she came upon the snake and she dodged just enough to the side that the wind of its passing raised the fine hairs on her arm. As the tip of its head came even with her to her left, she flipped her knife into her left hand with the open edge of the curve toward her back, set her right hand against the hilt and drove it in as deep as she could, the knife scraping against the bone of its skull, the curve of the blade keeping it from catching or breaking. Her forward momentum and the snakes conspired to open a deep, gaping wound that trailed from its nostrils to the point where it slipped from the branch to fall down, down to the forest floor far beneath them. She was so angry, so she trembling as she turned to face their opponent once again. That wasn't a very nice thing to say, the woman chided her. Implying that I'm not very pretty isn't any way to make friends. But Sakura was done talking. She'd put the woman between herself and her teammates, which would have meant something with another enemy, but now her desperate lunge forward was made only with a hope to rejoin the others, yank Naruto away by his collar if necessary, and get as far from this woman as her skills would take her. Without any evidence that this was difficult, that these enormous snakes cost her any more effort than a thrown kunai, she summoned another one and Sakura was forced to leap aside or be crushed under the weight of its manifestation. Before she could make it back up to the branch, it struck at the boys and it was Naruto who stopped it. Her gratitude fell flat when he just taunted Sasuke-kun, calling him a scaredy cat in reflection of Sasuke-kun's earlier insult to him. Part of her went serves him right when the woman dismissed the summon and her tongue darted out quicker than the snake itself had moved, drawing Naruto back to her. She didn't see what sort of jutsu she used on Naruto, but she clearly saw the moment when she lifted him up as if he weighed nothing and tossed him aside. When he bounced off the tree's bark limply and began to fall, her hand darted to her kunai pouch and her throw drove it deep through his loose jacket and into the tree. A shudder made its way down her spine as the Kusanin glanced down at her. "You're proving to be quite the vexing little prey, aren't you? There you are, all trembling, but you're the only one covered in the blood of your slain enemies. How very interesting. Sasuke-kun." She shouted up at her teammate, ignoring the clear ploy to draw her into another conversation. She meant it as encouragement to take up his original plan. He was closer to Naruto and stronger than she was. He could have taken the opportunity to throw Naruto over his shoulder, toss the woman the scroll retrieved from Naruto's kit, and attempt to make a clean escape. He took it as something else, jerking to awareness of himself like he'd been slapped, and the battle that followed was conducted at speeds she almost couldn't follow with her eyes. But she did see the moment when the Kusanin dodged Sasuke-kun's kunai by shifting her head only an incremental fraction and she understood, this is why Kakashi-sensei called my dodging sloppy. It moved so quickly over so much territory that she caught up to them only at the end of it, when they'd looped back around almost to where they'd begun and he had the woman bound to a tree. She suspected what would come next before he used the Katon, Ryuka no Jutsu. His aim, her mind registered dimly, was off, the fire searing a hole through the tree trunk just above and to the right of the enemy nin. And she only screamed the once, shrill and high and cut short quickly. It was, she thought as she drew nearly abreast with Sasuke-kun, somehow, too clean, almost. Because it wasn't natural fire, it hadn't scorched the bark much outside the target zone, but none of the woman's clothes had caught fire and while her skin on her forehead had drooped and melted, it wasn't blackened or burnt. "Get back," she snapped, reaching forward instinctively to snatch at Sasuke-kun's collar, but the woman was quicker. Sasuke-kun had let the wire go slack, so there was nothing to stop her hands from running through seals, her whole neck elongating as she struck out at Sasuke-kun, burying her teeth deep into his neck. Sakura turned her grab into a strike, but the woman pulled away with a satisfied smirk. Sasuke-kun collapsed to his knees, clutching at his neck, which wasn't bleeding freely like it should have been. His small, half-smothered noises of pain tugged at her more than screaming might have and she crouched beside him helplessly, her eyes still fixed on their enemy. The melted mess of face had obscured one eye and the woman reached up and tore the sagging flesh away, revealing much paler skin beneath. A striking eye, unnervingly intelligent and amused, its piercing gold skillfully emphasized with deep purple. Caught by that gaze, she almost didn't notice that the symbol he wore had changed from that of Kyusagakuer to the single note that she'd only seen once before. "What did you do to Sasuke-kun?" she demanded. The voice that answered her was far lower and somehow more menacing for the fact that and it was certainly he retained that playful edge. "I just gave him a little parting gift. I think you'll find it very useful when it comes time to face my team. I'm sure he'll like it. Very soon, I think Sasuke will seek me out. He'll desire my power." He tilted his head, as if in consideration. "I wonder, if you would tell me why you didn't think I was dead, when Sasuke so clearly thought so and was relieved for it." "It's not my first time setting people on fire," Sakura answered in a low voice. She was further unnerved to see that answer made him smile. "Ah. I'll keep that in mind. I wouldn't linger here, if I were you. I told my team to pay you a visit and it's a bad place to receive guests." And then he was gone and Sasuke-kun was all but whimpering next to her, so she tucked her knife away and knelt properly beside him, reaching forward with the intention of checking his wound. She didn't expect him to collapse into her, still making those pitiful noises, his skin so hot she could feel it even through the barrier of her clothes. Though the timing was completely inappropriate, her heart seized, especially when her hands came up automatically to draw him closer to her. Her hand cradled the back of his head and found his hair so very fine and downy soft, and as his body sprawled across her lap, his head was pressed against her sternum. It was a strange, powerfully mixed feeling, partly very maternal, like she was cradling a hurting child to her chest, partly that of a girl very close to the object of her desire. It was his scent that anchored her, because beneath that smoky smell that always lingered, he smelled like sweat and fear. She glanced helplessly behind her, but Naruto remained pinned to the tree where she'd left him, his jacket still holding for the moment. Sakura was alone again. Kill your heroes. Chapter 15. Ligyrophobia, Part I. Sakura retrieved Naruto after a brief inspection of the somewhat ragged bite marks in Sasuke-kun's neck convinced her that they were less worrying than the dark blotches pooled like ink beneath his skin, forming some kind of seal. Or at least that was her best guess. Fuinjutsu was leagues beyond academy material, so she had to accept that whatever purpose it was meant to serve, she could only take away from it that he'd wanted Sasuke-kun alive, and all she could do was wait it out. If she handled Naruto more roughly than was strictly called for because she was more than half convinced this was his fault, even if Sakura knew logically that their escape was unlikely from the moment that man decided that Sasuke-kun was his prey, she was still angry enough at him that she didn't feel a shred of guilt. She dropped him unceremoniously to the branch where she'd left Sasuke-kun, grimly considering what needed done and what she was capable of doing. She needed to get them out of this forest. Sakura didn't care if they forfeited this exam. She didn't care how upset her teammates might be. They could still be angry with her in another 6 months, when they'd be eligible to take the exam again. But that was only what she wanted. Unless a proctor intervened, or something else occurred, the chances of reaching safety without encountering the Otonin team were dismal. It was a large forest, yes, but someone like that wouldn't promise a visit from his team without being certain that it would occur. Not when she was absolutely certain that the man they'd met was Orochimaru, because how many people in the world could possibly be able to summon giant snakes so easily? There was a part of her that wanted to know why he needed Sasuke-kun at all, and another that wondered why he'd left Naruto and her alive and not just taken him when he'd collapsed. But the reasons didn't matter at this moment, just surviving until there was a safer time to worry about those things. So what she needed to do was retreat to somewhere more defensible than this, somewhere where she could wait for Naruto to regain consciousness. Their chances still wouldn't be good, but they'd be better. She hadn't noticed any blood on him that hadn't come from where she'd touched him, and his temperature and color were much better than Sasuke-kun's, so after attempting to a standard genjutsu dispel in case it was a subtle one she couldn't sense failed, she left him be. Sakura was mightily proud of herself for not kicking him in the side to test that theory. That reminded her that she still needed to bind up the wound in her own side, which didn't take her very long. She just swabbed it down with an antiseptic towelette and pressed a bandage firmly over it. Because she hadn't torn away, it was a fairly clean puncture, and the pain, compared to Wave, was hardly worth mentioning. If her arms ached from holding herself up inside the snake, that too could be ignored. First aid finished, she tucked her trash back in her pouch and considered the next pressing issue, which was one of logistics. There were 2 of the boys and only 1 of her. And she was fairly certain they both happened to outweigh her. She'd carried Tajuna before, who probably weighed as much as both of them combined, but that had been for a short distance, just like when she'd snatched Sasuke-kun. And even if she managed the weight itself, there were still 2 of them. Sakura needed her temples, probably smearing more blood across her face as she did so, though she'd scrubbed her hands with her towelette as she considered the issue. It wasn't possible in the normal course of things for one girl to be capable of carrying that kind of burden. But, she realized as she stared at their battlefield, it's not as if the normal rules apply. I can leap over 20 feet from a standstill. It's not as if I don't know how to augment and reinforce my muscles and joints with chakra. There shouldn't be anything to stop me from doing that continually. That's the whole theory behind the Shunshin no Jutsu. Kakashi-sensei said I wasn't ready for that, but while that kind of speed would be useful, I just need a little more strength. That much she thought she might be able to do. As for her other issue, she found her solution in taking a great deal of pleasure cutting the arms off Naruto's jacket, as he was the only one with fabric to spare. She had wire in her kit, but she didn't keep any kind of rope. She tied the resultant strips into 3 different lengths. She crossed Naruto's arms across his chest and used the shortest of her lengths to tie his forearms together, forming a loop which she dragged over her head. That left Naruto draped down her back and she pulled his knees forward, tying him into a piggyback position that she further secured by the last length, which she looped under his arms, drawing the length between them and over her own shoulders, pulled it down under her own arms and tying it behind her back. By the time she was done, her shoulder joints felt mildly abused, but Naruto was as secure as she could make him. She'd been careful to try this close enough to Sasuke-kun that she wouldn't have to kneel and then rise again with Naruto's weight on her back, and she gathered Sasuke-kun up far more carefully than she had her blonde teammate. As he lay quiescent in her arms, she experienced a brief flash of jealousy. She wanted Sasuke-kun to be carrying her Heim style and taking responsibility for getting all of them out of this forest alive. There was only one good thing about this, she thought as she stood up carefully. Sasuke-kun's weight balanced out Naruto's, so she didn't have to worry about leaning forward or back to counterbalance. And they weren't as heavy as she'd feared, but she could feel it as a steady drain on her chakra. If they'd ever taught a lecture at the academy about going to ground with your teammates unconscious, Sakura had somehow missed it, though at just this moment it seemed like an awfully practical lecture to have. But she had sat through lectures on defensible positions, and though their practicals hadn't been conducted in forests quite like these, she had some idea what she was looking for. Almost 40 minutes of making toward the tower later, where there were guaranteed to be adults whereas the borders of the zone were probably less well patrolled, she found what she was looking for. Large branches that had broken out of treetops and caught on their way down, somehow tenuously held in place without any guarantee of staying there, were called widowmakers for good reason. Sometimes it was whole treetops, ripped free in especially violent storms. At other times, it could refer to whole trees, twisted or broken midway up the trunk and not yet come down. With these behemoth trees, even branches were the size of the normal tree trunks, and when Sakura caught sight of an immense branch suspended by what seemed a very tenuous, fraying little section and the unsteady support of some nearby branches, she had a flash of inspiration. It was a death trap waiting to happen. And it was just what Sakura needed. She kept a wary eye on the branch as she came beneath it, flinching every time the wind made it creak, but she didn't have time to waste on fear. One of the trees almost directly below it had heavy curtains of moss growing up its roots, and she carefully pulled them up and away without tearing them. A kunai was not a shovel, but it was the best thing she had to work with, and she set to it with an industriousness born of fear. Luck seemed to be slightly on her side in this instance, for she hadn't done much digging when she collapsed a wall of earth and discovered some sort of animal den. Its entrance was from the other side of the route, which was why she hadn't noticed it to begin with, but it lessened her need to dig considerably. It seemed abandoned, with no fresh tracks leading in, which was why she felt fairly confident in stowing her teammates inside once she'd widened the entrance on her side enough. She sealed it back when she managed to shove both of them inside, restoring the moss to as much of an undisturbed position as possible, counting on the animals' entrance to provide fresh air. Sake hoped that neither of them woke up and panicked, thinking that they'd been buried alive, but she didn't have much time to spare for their feelings. She made her way into the trees next, using Sasuke-kun's wire and blasting powder to rig a deadfall on a scale she'd never imagined it could be done. And when she was finished, she layered the Magen, Kokunai or Reizu no Jutsu over it, so that to anyone not paying much attention or to anyone insensitive to genjutsu, it looked like a normal branch. Most of her quick and dirty trap knowledge relied on using young saplings to fling kunai or shuriken or pull tight snares, but these trees were so enormous and well established that there wasn't enough light or water for much underbrush. This sort of environment, or really any sort of environment, was why Doton users were considered the trap masters of the ninja world. She didn't have enough time to dig pitfalls by hand, so she crossed that off her mental list, alongside anything that required complex seals or blasting powder or much in the way of equipment. So, minefield was out. She wasn't certain she would have been able to stomach the results, regardless. Shrapnel damage was an ugly thing, even in photographs, and having seen the result of fire, she didn't know if she was frightened enough to do such a thing with premeditation. In the moment, to save herself, she might do anything, but there was a vast gulf between that and setting out to do something as likely to maim as kill outright. What would she do if they survived the initial blast? Would she have enough composure to finish what she'd started? And if the answer to that was yes, how much would she have to pay for it in her nightmares later? She didn't take too much time to consider what-ifs, though. Just enough time for a deep, stabbing feeling of regret on how limited her equipment was. She'd already lost 4 Kunao inside the first snake and she couldn't raid her teammates' supplies entirely, so even a clever system of trip wires hidden in the grass that would pull tight wire at throat level was costly in terms of supplies. She limited herself to only those points of ingress that would be difficult for her to keep under surveillance. In the other places, she rigged devices more aimed toward alerting her to anyone's approach than causing harm, all of which were done with scavenged materials. And when that was finished, all she had left to do was wait. And worry. As that waiting dragged on and she found herself twitched at insect noises, she had a brief thought that she suddenly understood why Kakashi-sensei dragged that nasty book everywhere. It wasn't the preparation that was the worst thing. It was the waiting, where her imagination was free to invent all sorts of terrible things, that was proving to be the hardest obstacle to overcome. Because, now, she had time to consider just what she was staying to face. Time to lose her nerve, to consider abandoning her teammates. If it was just her, she knew that she'd probably make to the tower. She'd live on, without having to endure the pain she was certain was coming. But, she thought as she dropped her head into her hands, if she ran now, that would be it. She'd be the trash Kakashi-sensei had talked about. At the same time, she really did not want to be here. Those two conflicting emotions were pressing so hard on her that she was almost glad when something tripped one of her alerts and she raised her head to see 3 shinobi stride into the clearing. She recognized them from registration, but the notes on their Hitai 8 would have given them away regardless. Sakura didn't say anything, just stood and waited to see how they would proceed. She remembered how Kabuto had fared against them, so she wasn't about to risk herself in a head-on attack. They seemed somehow surprised to see her. Of course, she had a good idea that she looked like an escapee from a splatter film, blood drying in her hair and turning it into a stiff spiked mess, making her clothes stink like a slaughterhouse, and itching as it flaked from her skin. It was the bandaged ninja with the strange gait who moved into the clearing first, and demanded gruffly, "Girl, where's Sasuke?" Sakura shrugged, relieving some of the tension and stiffness in her shoulders from where she'd been sitting and anticipating this fight. His single eye narrowed. "I'm not in the mood to play games with you, girl. Get Sasuke. He's the only reason we're in this village. Or is he too much a coward to come out and fight? Got himself a girl protecting him." That earned him a dirty look from his female teammate, but Sakura acknowledged that had either Naruto or Sasuke-kun been conscious, that sort of taunt would have brought Naruto out of hiding and at least primed Sasuke-kun to reveal himself. "Sorry to disappoint," Sakura said curtly. But apparently Orochimaru's presence cut 2 ways. She was interested to see Doso's eye narrow at the mention of Orochimaru's name. "What do you mean by that?" the one in the middle demanded. "Doso? Yes, something like that." And the one to his left was Zaku, and their kunoichi was kin. "Does it matter? Maybe the sound of us killing his girlfriend here will be enough to flush him out of hiding," Zaku sneered. Given how he'd looked when she'd walled them up, Zaku could have tortured her for days without achieving that. "Maybe she'd be more willing to talk if we roughed her up a little," Kin suggested, and that made a smirk break across Zaku's face. So she wasn't surprised when the 3 of them leapt toward her. Her substitution was as quick as certain knowledge that no one was coming to help her could make it, and before they could even look up, she'd already slammed her hands together in the final seal for the Magen, Narakumi no Jutsu. Kill your heroes. Chapter 16. Ligyrophobia, Part 2. Sakura struck as soon as she saw the ghost, the hilt of her kunao impacting with a sickening crack just behind Doso's temple. He crumbled instantly and she began to pivot towards Zaku next, but Kin's hand was already slapping down on his shoulder and she was regretting the seconds she'd thought to save pulling the stabbing end of her kunao free. The blast of air hit her like a wall and she wasn't entirely certain the creak from her ribs was a product of her imagination, but she skidded back some 20 feet from the force of the blow, digging the fingers of her open hand into the turf and using chakra to keep herself from being sent tumbling. To break free that easily, She's either a genjutsu specialist or they're ridiculously overqualified to become Chunin. Probably both, Sakura thought to herself as she just avoided another blast, the wind ruffling her hair. And one's got a weapon I can feel but can't see. Her body was trembling from the fear and the frustration, but she forced her breathing to slow from its quick, erratic pace. She wasn't going fresh into this battle. Sakura didn't need to compound that. Not when she was facing two enemies who were the subordinates of Orochimaru. If she was facing Zaku alone, she'd feel more confident in being able to test the limits of his ability without getting critically injured, but there was also Kin to consider. And as she dodged another blast, this one carrying Kunao in it, and found herself sprouting a shoulder full of Senbon needles for her trouble, she spared enough time for a single, vile thought that encompassed Orochimaru, the Proctors, and Naruto. Then she didn't have any more time to spare. They were both rushing her, and while that gave them both space to mock her freely, it took every lesson that Kakashi-sensei and the Ninken had painfully inscribed into her mind and muscles to just keep herself from further injury. The Senbon burned and pulled every time she moved her arm, but she'd only managed to pluck out the most painful, though action was working the others loose. God, this is annoying, Kin snarled as Sakura twisted herself out of the way of another barrage of Senbon, one passing so close to her right eye she'd swear she'd felt it brush against her eyelashes, and she had to shove through a wall of almost in my eye. To not freeze up. What good are you when you won't even scream? We're here for Sasuke, not to waste time playing with the likes of you. Need something to change the field. If it stays like this, I'm going to make a mistake. And that will be it, she thought with gritted teeth. I just need to. The sound of bells jerked her full attention back to the external battlefield as she flipped backwards, well behind the line where a group of Senbon, bells still tingling merrily, divided the battlefield. What, just going to keep running away? Zaku taunted. Man, I knew Konohamanin were pathetic, but that's just sad. You can take care of her, Kin. I'll see if I can't find our prey. No way does a Konohamanin just leave her teammates. He's gotta be around here somewhere. He glanced over to where his teammate still lay unconscious. If Dosu doesn't wake up soon, he's gone to miss out on all the glory. Kin shrugged, in a "it's his problem, not mine" sort of fashion, fresh Senbon already splayed like spines in her hand. Sakura had two Kunao in hand and she darted forward, ducking beneath the jangling group of Senbon in her attempt to get at Kin. She saw the shadow wave. She had only a split second to decide, and as she felt the Senbon go deep, burning as they pierced skin and her movement tore muscle, she had a moment's regret, but she gritted her teeth and shoved herself forward. As she pressed onward regardless, she heard the previously still bells jingle and she braced herself for another attack. It was only when her stumble wasn't a single misstep that she could write, but like the first signs of a stroke, a terrible inability to move her body like she ought to be able to, that she had the first premonition of Kin's real ability. She couldn't get her eyes to focus, seeing double, triple, more, and it was difficult to even stay upright. Sakura almost fell, caught herself awkwardly with one hand, and her stomach lurched. Bile spattered across the ground and the back of her hand. Kin's laughter seemed to chase her as she made a retreat that followed a drunkard's path, weaving and tripping, but urged on by desperation to a quickness that meant she saw the world as a series of multiple after-images, worse than any fever dream. But she kept at it, pushing herself up again and again as she almost fell. Until she stumbled in such a way that she couldn't recover from, over a protruding root that her genjutsu-addled senses missed. She cried out heavily as she landed, and again as Kin's blunt nails left trails down her scalp, closing over her ponytail. Under all that blood, your hair's softer than mine, Kin said in a tone full of disgust. You must be so proud of it, she sneered, yanking hard. Sakura curled forward like she trying to pull away, and Kin turned into a movement of her violence, pressing her head down until she was driving her forehead into the grass. Her hands hidden by her body, Sakura formed the familiar hand sign for concentration. Genjutsu, Kai, Sakura thought to herself as she forcibly interrupted her chakra. The nausea and disorientation disappeared instantly, and what was left was Kin, doing nothing more than the bullies at the academy had done. Must not have had anyone to pull her hair, she thought nastily. Hurts less when you're pulling all of it. She levered herself up, even as Kin tried to press her head back down, and saw that despite, or rather because of Kin's efforts, Her broken wing gambit had worked. Sakura's hand closed firmly around the wrist of the hand clutching at her hair and she lunged forward, her free hand dropping her kunai to stiff-arm the wire hidden in the grass. The wire above her head, almost indistinguishable from spider silk as it swayed in the breeze, suddenly whined with tension as it was pulled tight enough to play pizzicato on. And from where Kin was standing, tight enough to slit her throat, if she'd been incrementally slower at bringing up a kunai up to keep the wire from slicing into her skin. The black-haired kunoichi was cursing aloud as she tried to hold it steady, the kunai itself pressed uncomfortable tight against her neck, and Sakura was silently cursing well-honed reflexes, but that didn't stop her from spinning her body up into a kick and catching the hilt of the kunai with the base of her heel, driving it straight up into soft flesh. Kin had managed to shift back, just as little, as Sakura's kick had meant she'd shifted her grip on Kin's arm. Her hand on the hilt changed the angle unfavorably and Kin had tilted her head back by reflex, so though Sakura felt the resistance of bone, the kunai scraped along the outside of her jawbone rather than going up into that defenseless triangle between jaw and neck. Bleeding freely, Kin dropped the kunai, hand coming up to check the severity of the wound, while the other dipped into her pouch. As soon as her foot touched back down, Sakura hooked one foot behind Kin's knees and jerked hard enough that the other girl fell heavily. Sakura drew one of her knives as she pounced, angling for the liver, managing to drive it perhaps half an inch before Kin landed a ringing blow upside her ear that snapped her head to the side and toppled her off the other girl. She managed to recover her feet before Kin could reverse the situation, struggling hard not to clutch at her ear like Kin was the neck wound. It was difficult not just because of the pain, which was bad enough, but also because a faint, tinny noise was all she could hear out of it. She tried hard not be set off balance by that, either physically or emotionally, but it would be so easy to just run away now. It hurts, was throbbing in her ear, the burning of senbon, the soreness of overworked muscles. Her grip tightened as Kin brought another handful of senbon up to her face and sneered at her through them. "I'm going to make you pay for this," she promised. Sakura tensed, but before either of them could make any move toward the other, a voice from just behind Kin interrupted. "Just so you know, I'm taking this," a cheerful voice interrupted and Kin half turned on one heel, to reveal a ninja who couldn't have been more than 2 foot from her. This was a scroll, being waggled idly in one hand. The ninja would have been cute in almost any other setting, with the soft angled features that would always make him look years younger than his real age. His hair was in purposeful disorder, his fringe kept out of his face on the right by 2 yellow star barrettes that would have appealed to Sakura when she was about 8, the hair itself a light brown with a strangely purple tint to it, his eyes a shade of yellow. His clothing built on that image of childishness that he'd reinforced with his manner of speech, his shirt sleeves long enough to obscure his hands almost entirely. "I took it off that fellow over there," he continued blithely, using the scroll to point to Dosuo, as he didn't look like he needed it. "Just so you're not wondering where it went later." "You," Kin said, darting forward, but he plucked a long knife from a horizontal sheath behind his back as he tucked the scroll away. He dodged her strike, opening up a slice on her arm when she overextended herself slightly. It wasn't a very long cut, but Kin's eyes widened and then she screamed. The easy smile never failed as Kin backed away from him, her breath coming as high-pitched pants, like little smothered screams. Her steps were unsteady and she'd gone pale, the first beads of sweat forming on her brow. Sakura got her first good look at his knife then and found it strange and cruel looking, with full, deep serration along the length of the blade. There seemed to be some sort of decorative pattern etched into the blade, but she couldn't make it out and she wasn't about to risk getting closer. "Kin, what the hell?" Zuko demanded as he dropped down from where he'd been surveying the nearby area, but he cut himself off when he saw someone else had joined the field. "Got our scroll," Kin managed to pant, "your turn," and then she retreated, almost collapsing against a tree at the far edge of the clearing as she emptied her stomach. Zuko's eyes narrowed as he glared at the interloper. "What village are you from? Shouldn't you be with your team, not butting in on other people's battles?" The stranger shrugged. "Does my village matter? No one's friends in this forest. And as for my team, well," and there was a strange look in his eye for all that his tone never lost its lightness, "the Sandman came and took them all away, so I really wanted to hurt somebody. And when I came upon you bunch trying to take down prey too big for you, I couldn't resist." "That's okay, right, Oni-san?" he asked, directing the question to Sakura. That he asked in the same tone a child might ask for a cookie was unnerving, but she dipped her head in assent. Better one questionable ally than yet another enemy. Zuko took it as a challenge, because this time the blast from those holes in his hands was much more powerful, digging a furrow as it went. But while Sakura leapt aside, the stranger didn't move, but before the air blade could touch him, he'd sheathed his knife, his hands flowing through signs, and he made a sharp gesture with his mouth, like a dog barking. She couldn't see it with her eyes, but the evidence dust and grass blown away by a collision of wind fronts suggested wind nature ninjutsu. Zuko scowled, but it was movement from Doso's previously still body that worried her. The stranger followed the direction of her gaze. No preferences, Nei-san, one pain's as good as another, he said with an offhand salute, strolling lackadaisically toward the bandaged Otonin. She tried to shove that strange, brittle hardness in his eyes out of her mind, because Zuko was coming. She wondered bitterly if those tunnels required far less chakra than regular nature manipulations and just how deep his equipment pouches ran, because he wasn't offering her opportunities to close and showed no signs of the exhaustion she was feeling. And without closing, she had no way to end this battle in her favor, just desperately maintain the stalemate. He'd come down out of the trees, at least, and a thought came to Sakura. She had explosive notes in her pouch and a reluctance to use them, but the thought was heavy in her mind that if she'd struck harder, faster, more decisively, then she'd have one more death on her conscience, but one less fear driving her. And she discovered that this was one line she was willing to blur, if it meant survival. Whether that was admirable or not, she didn't know, but she did know that the only thought in her head wasn't one of regret, but a focus on watch my left, not my right. She never looked up, not once, relying entirely on her memory, as she made a calculated retreat. She tried to keep track of everyone and everything in the clearing, but found it beyond her skill, so did what she could to make her next attacks count, because timing was going to be everything. Kunao, tags slapped hastily on their handle, blasted dirt into the air, concealing the flight of one kunao that did not fly with its fellows. A second, heavier wave forced him back and covered the noise of lesser explosions overhead, and she rushed in, to give him no space to pay attention to anything but her. Something, though, must have alerted him to the danger, for at the last possible second, almost too late, he looked up. It was enough to save his life, but the massive trunk still clipped his shoulder, several tons of wood crashing down and tearing it free from the joint, breaking the collarbone and driving him to his knees. When the trunk hit the ground, it did so with a low, powerful sound, and a rumble that shook the earth. "Oh, not bad," a voice commented at her shoulder, and she glanced over to find their interloper looking on with an air of distinct satisfaction. Both of them jerked when a sudden, ominous aura suddenly pervaded the clearing, a forerunner to an eruption of purple-tinted chakra. Sakura stilled, her heart beating loud in her ears, as she took note of just where that chakra was coming from. "Sasuke-kun," she said, voice breaking on the second syllable of his name. "Who?" "My teammate." Brows pitched upward in question, he followed her gaze. "Your teammate," he repeated with an intonation whose blandness spoke for itself. "In that case, I'm going to feel free to leave, Nei-san. It was fun to play, but it seems like your teammate's in a snit." "Here, Nei-san," he said, pressing something into the palm of her hand. "A present, for being a good sport about the scroll." She didn't even glance down to see what it was. "The scroll didn't matter to me," she said bitterly. "You could have had ours, if you'd liked." "Thanks, for helping." A soft huff of laughter. "I don't think you really needed it, but the opportunity was too good to miss. If I couldn't touch the Sunanin, the arrogant Otonin were good enough. And I just needed the one scroll," he said. "It's the principle of the thing. If my teammates died for the mission, I could at least finish it, promotion or not." With that enigmatic statement, he was gone, and Sasuke-kun crested the trunk of the tree like a demon from some deep hell, his eyes gone red with Sharingan and markings like black flames crawling across his skin. He moved strangely, not quite a stagger, but as if he wasn't in full control of his body either. He surveyed the battleground, Zuko still on his knees, clutching at a shoulder that sat far lower than it should have, Doso panting from his brief bout against the stranger, shaking his head every so often like he couldn't get himself to focus, and Kin still making those terribly pained noises, tears streaming freely down her cheeks as her arm swelled, the edges of the wound turning blue. But Sakura was also breathing heavily, Senbon still caught in her flesh, the shallow gashes of Kunao she hadn't quite dodged trickling blood, and her whole body felt like a bruise from Zuko's attacks. This was apparently enough to offend Sasuke-kun, because his eyes swept over the Otonin like a hawk looking over rabbits staked out as bait. "They hurt you," he observed in a low, steady voice, his feet carrying him surely down the trunk to where Zuko was, and the other boy struggled to his feet. Sakura didn't even see Sasuke-kun move, but suddenly he was behind Zuko and he had him on his knees, his good arm twisted back in a suppression hold. "I should make this part of a matching pair for that," he said, twisting the arm back and up until it cracked and Zuko screamed. The self-satisfied smirk that twisted Sasuke-kun's lips was just like the one he'd worn in the Genjutsu Kakashi-sensei had shown her. She trembled as those black flames slithered across Sasuke's pale skin, flinching as he twisted Zuko's arm further simply because he could. She listened to him talk about power, and being an avenger, and a man he'd do anything to kill. She wanted to stop him, wanted to pull him away, but Sakura was afraid to touch him. "Sasuke," she said sharply, and his head came up, his gaze meeting her own. His eyes were wild again, but this time not with fear. "Sasuke, stop this. They're finished. It's over. We've won," she said, the last word bitter on her tongue. She didn't like the way Sasuke regarded her, but he let Zuko go, only to pin the ninja with his foot when he would have stood. "He hurt you, Sakura," Sasuke told her. "You shouldn't feel sorry for him." Sakura hadn't, not until this moment, and it was less that she felt overwhelming pity for the enemy shinobi and more that she was disturbed by Sasuke's actions. He wasn't that stranger she might never see again. He was someone she'd thought she'd known. Someone she'd trusted. She took tiny steps forward, until she was standing at Zuko's head and she drew him up roughly by his collar, Sasuke moving his foot so she could, and Zuko struggling to gain his own footing. "Go," she ordered Zuko curtly, and for once all his trash talk seemed to have evaporated. Sasuke's eyes said he didn't like allowing them to retreat, and Sakura hurriedly tugged free the last of Kin's senbon, letting them fall to her feet. And then, mastering herself, she hugged him tentatively, making a gentle shackle of her arms. "Please," she whispered, "let them go." Sakura didn't know if she'd regret sparing them, but some deep instinct told her she'd regret it more if she set Sasuke on them while he was like this. She'd feared his abilities, once, but this was the first time she'd feared Sasuke himself. This wasn't her teammate, this boy who talked about power regardless of price and looked at the ugly marks seething across his skin like they were some kind of revelation. Orochimaru had said Sasuke would seek him out. She'd never expected the boy she'd adored to be swayed so easily, but even as the marks retreated, she still couldn't make herself feel at ease around him. As she buried her face in the crook of his neck, she just wanted Sasuke-kun back. Kill your heroes. Chapter 17. Testophobia, Part I. They'd retrieved Naruto in a tense, awkward kind of silence, and Sakura had busied her hands with scavenging all the Sebon and Kunao that littered the field before the two of them had relocated to another location that Sasuke had deemed good enough. Exhausted and hurting, her fear of the nightmares tamped down by sheer physical misery, Sakura had been grateful when Sasuke had broken that silence by gruffly offering to keep watch while she slept. She woke very stiff and disoriented, to find herself guarded by two of Naruto's shadow clones. By the time Naruto and Sasuke returned, there was only one survivor, the other proving that it was quite possible to dispel a clone through blunt force trauma to the head. She was furious, because she still couldn't hear out of one ear. Her body had already begun liberally purpling with bruising before she'd curled up miserably, the wound in her side felt hot and swollen, and she'd fought through pain and fear for them, and they'd gone and done something like this. The knowledge that her deafness was likely only a perforated eardrum, a common enough injury in the academy and nothing that medic nins couldn't treat, same as her other injuries, didn't make them any less real or frightening in the present. While she'd slept, the pair of them had slunk off to acquire another scroll. And, judging by their expressions, they had been successful and thought that somehow made it better. One of the most infamous nin that ever worn a Konoha Hitaiate was targeting Sasuke, and they were still taking the exam. Naruto might have strutted up like a little bantam gamecock ready to crow, but he quailed at Sakura's expression, shrinking behind Sasuke, who looked wary, but stood his ground. Sakura, he said. He tossed a scroll to her, bearing the Earth designation. Here. Keep it safe. We're pressing on to the tower. Sakura choked on all the things she wanted to shout at him, because this was the first real gesture of trust he'd ever extended to her. It didn't make her anger vanish, but he'd ruined her momentum and it suddenly became awkward to snarl and rage at him. But awkward or not, compared to facing the Otonin, facing Orochimaru, upsetting Sasuke suddenly seemed so much less dire than it had back in the academy. Once, she'd have done almost anything if she'd thought it would please Sasuke. She'd have never anticipated as she saw his many faces, learned his moods, worked at his side, what she felt for him would evolve into something that was both less and more. Seeing his pain and vulnerability made her feel strangely possessive and privileged, but when he'd stopped trying to run and turned to fight an enemy despite an overwhelming difference in experience and power over something that didn't really matter, not like the lives of civilians or teammates, that had been the first time she'd ever thought Uchiha Sasuke could also be a fool. If we make it through to the tower, she asked, what do you intend to do? Huh? Naruto asked, shuffling from behind Sasuke now that it seemed she wasn't going to be yelling at them. What do you mean, Sakura-chan? Of course we're going to make to the third round and give em what for, he said, thumping one fisted hand into the palm of the other. Oh. Sakura said snidely. Maybe I should stop hitting you so hard, because you seem to be overlooking the Sunin targeting Sasuke. Sunin? He repeated blankly. Where? Part of her had been afraid that his response would be along the lines of Sanwa, but it looked like the legendary three had merited more attention than Chakra. If he wasn't so resilient, there were times when Sakura would have filed Naruto in the "too dumb to live" box. Orochimaru are you? Sakura replied, sounding out each of the syllables distinctly with the special kind of disdain only teenagers were capable of. Or did you forget the giant snakes? It doesn't matter, Sasuke said, interrupting Naruto's response. Once we reach the tower, this phase of the exam we'll be surrounded by Jounin and proctors. He won't try anything there. What if he won't have to? And there's still the third phase, she said, trying to temper her tone and not quite managing it. We don't know what that seal does, Sasuke. I think it would be better if we forfeited and you went into protective custody. Her teeth clicked together as his eyes narrowed, for a moment a perfect reflection of the moment before he'd stepped forward and smirked as he broke Zuko's arm and then gave it a twist just to hear him scream. There was something there that hadn't been before. She didn't know if it was danger, or cruelty, or anger, but it spoke to her lizard brain, made her want to go quiet and still and bristle in preparedness to bite back when he struck. Some of this must have shown on her face, because it was Sasuke who flinched and looked away. You're telling me to run? I won't. It's fine, he said stiffly. You shouldn't say anything about it. It's not like the Jounin are blind. If it's really that dangerous, Kakashi will do something to interfere. If she'd been the one marked, that wouldn't have been said with either resentment or certainty. Because she didn't mind being saved and because she'd learned that Kakashi-sensei could be counted on to appear only when you least wanted to see him or didn't particularly need him. And he was really big on consequences being their own lessons. Unless he thought Orochimaru himself was about to erupt through that seal, Kakashi-sensei would leave them to learn from their own mistakes. Sometimes, she wished that their Jounin-sensei expected less of them. Sakura maintained a disapproving silence for most of their journey to the tower, which wasn't nearly as harrowing after surviving the giant snakes and Otonin. With Naruto and Sasuke competing with each other like they were in a points match at the academy and eager to make up for the fact that both of them had hardly played a part in the last two battles, she lapsed into something like her old position, but instead of screaming for help when an Aimnin tried to grab her, she almost severed his fingers. They did make the tower, one of the last teams to do so, and by that time her suspicion about the unsanitary conditions of a snake's mouth and substandard follow-up had developed into a certainty of infection. But if Sasuke was pretending to not be living on the edge of exhaustion, she could pretend as well. She'd done well enough, having found being partially deaf useful as Naruto nattered on about acquiring the Earth Scroll, which apparently involved reckless bravery and the assistance of Kabuto, the silver-haired nin she'd suspected of being a hidden proctor from the moment she'd seen his ninja data cards. Personnel files weren't that classified, at least at the genin level, but foreign villages didn't like anyone accruing and analyzing data on their ninja, let alone dispensing it freely. And where had he gotten his information, if he was just a genin? Some of their fellow examins, like Gaara, hadn't competed in the exams before, so even Kabuto's previous attempts at the test shouldn't have given him that kind of knowledge. But, if he was a hidden proctor, why would he help Sasuke and Naruto? Unless, of course, he had the same sense of humor as Kakashi-sensei and would blithely announce that they'd failed just when they'd thought they'd won for accepting assistance. Their late arrival meant there was little time for recovery, just the call to form up. Anko, their head proctor, seemed to be just as enthusiastic in heaping abuse on their heads as they formed ranks according to their time of arrival rather than village affiliation as she had when she'd sent them into the forest. After they'd done a roll call, she scowled down at them. "What's this?" she sneered. "I didn't expect this many of you maggots to be staring up at me when we made it here. Some of you probably already know, but there's been a joint decision by village leaders to make this last phase an exhibition match. Show our clients a little of what they're paying for. We wanted to showcase our best and brightest, but it looks like they'll just have to settle for not falling asleep. We don't have enough open slots for all of you, so we're going to have to do some major culling before any of you get any bright ideas about making Chunin. So hang tight, ladies, while we decide who we're going to feed to the Inyazuka dogs. And, maggots, I hear you taking this opportunity to share a little gossip. You're gonna be waiting with your face on the floor and my foot making you eat it. Got that?" There was a ragged chorus of affirmative answers. "I said, you got that," she roared. This time, they managed something more like what she apparently considered a proper response, because she turned on her heel, trench coat flaring dramatically. For a long moment, there was only utter silence, but then it was punctuated by the rustle of clothing as someone shifted restlessly. Someone else coughed. Sakura didn't know how long or if someone would work up enough courage to defy Anko's orders, but she took the opportunity to sneak looks at the Jounin instructors ranged along the balcony. Most of them had clustered in group according to village, murmuring to each other in low voices and looking over the assembled genin. Though Kakashi-sensei had no sense of either camaraderie or urgency, leaning against the wall and giving his book his full attention, the green-clad Jounin next to him was apparently undeterred and holding a one-way conversation. She felt her eyebrow twitch. There was no way that particularly appalling fashion statement was a coincidence. She was almost certain this man was Rock Lee's Jounin-sensei. Her eyes swept over other groups, until she came to another figure who apparently didn't care for the company. And she felt a chill sweep over her, prickling her scalp and catching at her breathing. The sound note symbol was her first clue, but she might have guessed regardless. There was that same sense of gender ambiguity: handsome woman, pretty man, coupled with those two intense eyes. The lips might smile, but it was those eyes that promised to eat you alive. Flak jackets, though his was a slightly more flattering design and color than the Konoha standard, always minimized the differences usually so obvious in their casual uniforms. But in this case it was mostly the jawline that lent him a certain femininity. Most men didn't have that perfectly tapered V. Otherwise, he might have been the kind of refined Eichmann that fell within her strike zone. He looked nothing at all like he had in the forest, but his eyes caught hers and his lips quirked up. Sakura was nowhere near as skilled at reading lips as Ino, who'd turned a hobby for gathering gossip into a useful skill, but she was almost certain he'd said, "Am I pretty now?" Sakura shuddered hard enough that she drew looks, but she fisted her hands and reminded herself to breathe. It would have been better, she thought, if he looked even slightly worried about being caught here. Instead, he still had space to taunt a genin who was surprised to have been left alive from their first encounter. He was playing games. Given the stories, he had more than enough battle experience to judge the situation. That he wasn't worried about the Hokage and over 24 Jounin was so deeply unnerving to it was the same kind of crushing pressure that his killing intent had carried. And, somehow, she didn't think it was just a facade. This paralyzed as the fear in the forest hadn't, because the consequences of her actions in this room would be magnified by all the people in it. It wasn't just her life at stake. It wasn't even her squad's life at stake. If she revealed him, tried to interfere in whatever game he was playing, she had no doubt his reprisal would be instant and bloody. How many of the genin, standing here with no idea of the snake in their midst, would die? How many of the Jounin sensei would die in defense of their students? It looked like a large room, but if Orochimaru summoned one of his snakes, how many would be crushed even in its death throes? The choice was like a razor-sharp kunai held to her neck. Keep silent, be complicit, and save lives, or open her mouth and condemn everyone. What seemed like the right thing, the proud thing, might not be the good thing for all these people, who might not be involved in his plot. Whatever he wanted, it had to do with Sasuke. Maybe, she thought with a sudden flash of insight, he's testing Sasuke and that seal again. After all, the first time should have left the Otonin team out of the running, but if they were here, they were all either as resilient as Naruto or operating on the kind of loyalty that made zealots into martyrs. She came to a decision then. Even to protect her teammate, she wasn't prepared for the kind of collateral damage that trying to draw attention to his real identity might cause. She wasn't even assured of success. She wanted to believe that the Hokage and the Jounin already knew about him, that for some reason, maybe the same reason they weren't interfering, but her faith in the omnipotence of adults had died in wave, even if she'd survived. He was watching her. And he was enjoying her agony. Sakura bit her tongue and tore her eyes away from Orochimaru's, focusing her eyes in the middle distance just above Sasuke's left shoulder, trying to swallow down her nausea. She'd never had to make a decision like this before. She shouldn't have to make a decision like this. She was a genin. Her choices should have to do with what to have for breakfast, and hairstyles, and what pair of shoes she wanted to save up to buy. Choices that, if she screwed them up, only affected her. She knew that was only wishful thinking, because she'd just come from a hard lesson on how the actions of one member of the team had repercussions for the whole squad, but she'd come to a limited acceptance of the choices she'd made concerning her path in life. If only life would stop making it so damn hard. Anko returned. Now, she drawled, if it was up to me, we'd have the time and make you run it again, and see who's standing then. But Hokage-sama has decided it's faster to give you a little taste of what you're going to get. Preliminary elimination matches. Half of you are going to be out on your asses by the time this is over, she said, jerking her thumb across her throat in unmistakable threat. All right maggots, last chance. Surrender now or count yourself willing to be left on the floor in pieces. This one's on your own heads, so don't be looking at your teammates. Sakura was tired and afraid, and her ambition to become Chunin in her first year out of the academy had been crushed beneath the weight of reality. And Sasuke and Naruto would be free to do whatever it was they wanted. Her hand trembled a little with the very small weight of regret and shame, but she began to raise it and declare herself out of the exam. Except Sasuke, like he had eyes in the back of his head, snatched her hand without turning and clutched it tight enough her imagination supplied the sound of bones creaking. Don't run away now, he said in a low voice. We've come this far. We've got to finish it. Kill your heroes. Chapter 18. Testophobia, Part 2. The time to surrender passed her by almost without notice as she wrestled with Sasuke's motive for catching her hand in Anko's contemptuous, "All right, maggots, clear the floor," washed through her like the shock of bitterly cold water. She wanted to call out wait, but social conditioning pressed down on her almost as hard as her teammates' grip. There was shame and embarrassment waiting there, whereas before it would have been a tactical retreat. And her old pride, which she'd thought trampled by exhaustion and pain and reality, was present enough that she couldn't muster the courage pull a Naruto and demand that Anko let her leave, go home, take a nap and let her teammates face the rest of the exam on their own. She didn't know if he was really brave, or just oblivious, but whichever it was, she wasn't. And there would be another chance soon enough. It wasn't hard to lose a fight. Still, she yanked her hand free of Sasuke's grip and stalked up one of the stairways to where she'd marked Kakashi-sensei earlier. Sakura was careful to not even glance toward Orochimaru, though she had the unsettling sensation of being watched, the fine hairs on her neck prickling. Just paranoia, she told herself. If he looked in their direction, it would be Sasuke he'd be staring at. She was just dross. Kakashi-sensei glanced at her and his brow rose, but he didn't otherwise react. She didn't know why she'd expected anything different. He'd had plenty of time to take in the blood-spattered view. Naruto and his need for attention soon turned Kakashi-sensei's gaze elsewhere and Sakura listened in grim silence as Anko gleefully outlined the rules, which were pretty much the same as the forest. No whining if you ended up dead. If she clenched her jaw any tighter, her molars were going to crack. Sakura let her arms, which had been crossed tightly across her chest, fall limply to her sides. She sidled closer to Kakashi-sensei, ignoring the proctor announcing the first match. Tenten the Kunoichi from Rock Lee's team and Yoroi Akadua. She didn't need to watch. She had no intentions of competing in the third section of the exam, and she'd had a bellyful of fighting in these days in the forest. Catching Kakashi-sensei's attention, she mouthed bathroom, and he tilted his head toward one of the doors. Turn left when you hit the junction. And don't leave this floor. His tone was serious and Sakura nodded, accepting it for the warning it was. You didn't build a tower in the middle of a lethal forest for the scenery, you did it because whatever purpose the tower served when not in use in the exams, it needed the clear keep-away that the forest of death and its inhabitants provided. Most of the spectators, their attention fixed on the match, didn't even notice as she slunk out the door. And she didn't much care about the ones who did. She found the bathroom just where Kakashi-sensei had said it would be, and after taking care of business, she spent long minutes at the sink scrubbing blood and mud from her skin. Sakura felt anger like a tight, hard knot behind her breastbone as she watched the water swirl down the drain, as dirty as she felt. The water was shockingly cold against her flushed face, and when she pulled up her vest to check on what was beginning to feel like a second heartbeat, she flinched when she tugged at the corner of the bandage. Better, she decided after a moment, to let sleeping dogs lie if you don't have any way of putting them down again. There was nothing she could do for her hair, the blood having set as stiff and unflatteringly as overly liberal gel. And her clothes were a mess. She'd either have to burn them or expend a lot of effort to get them clean. It was a real pity that they'd been so expensive, because she'd really have preferred the burning option. If I survive this match, Sakura thought, plucking at the stained fabric of her vest, I am going to thank my mother for doing my laundry for so many years. When she couldn't find anything else to straighten or tidy and she was only wasting water, she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders and made to return to the arena. And nearly barreled someone as she flung open the door and stepped through it with a certainty she didn't feel. Luckily, the near victim was quick on his feet, dancing back out of the way in a movement that seemed somehow playful, hands held up in mock surrender. Ah, he said, recognition breaking across his face. Oni-san. You made it to the party after all. Sakura bit her lip to keep back a biting comment about his definition of parties. Thanks again for what you did back there, she said instead, because it was the boy from the forest. It came out a little strained, because she was exhausted and bloody and he was wearing those star-shaped barrettes and those too long sleeves and looking like he'd strolled out of the academy after a session with a lecturer with a sense of humor. He shrugged it off. Just took advantage, is all. Going back to watch the fights. Sakura nodded. Mind if I come along? The Jounin processing forms for my teammates recommended the view. There's apparently a ton of paperwork involved in retrieving and removing bodies, he said lightly. Though there are more bits, from what I saw of what the Sandman left behind. There was that hard, brittle look in his eyes again, at odds with the lightness of his voice. Silly of them, you know, to try something like that while I was scouting. But I got back in time to watch the climax of the show. A little more bloody than yours, Nei-san. That reminds me, did you use my present? Sakura had almost forgotten about the little container, which she'd tucked away in favor of dealing with Sasuke and hadn't had time to think about since. She fished it out of her pack and was relieved to find it hadn't broken or leaked, the amber substance still safely behind the container walls. I don't even know what it is, she confessed. Or your name, she said with a frown. Harafu. Yours, Oni-san. Harano Sakura. He grinned. See, there is such a thing as serendipity. What I gave you, it's venom. Black Mamba. Sometimes you pick out things you think suit people, and there's all different ways of killing in the world, so I thought I'd give you something that matched your style. You're clean in your strikes. You don't play around, don't cut just to see someone bleed. So I thought it suited you. Fu unsheathed his own knife and laughed when Sakura tensed. No need to fear, Nei-san. Just look. And she did, because his knife was just as cruel and strange up close as the first time she'd glimpsed it. Long, broad, With that deep, hooked serration she'd noticed before, it was more designed to tear than slash. Despite herself, she moved a little closer. "What are those grooves?" she asked. They traced from the hilt to the tip of each serrated edge, almost like a snake's fangs. "They deliver the venom payload," he explained, confirming her suspicions. "Venom has to enter the bloodstream to be effective, provided you don't have ulcers or open sores in your mouth. You can drink the stuff, but you lose potency smearing it on a blade. So there are channels engraved in the metal and they're sealed with a very thin clear polymer. I'd explain the delivery system, but that's a secret," he said teasingly. "I call it reciprocity. Do you have a name for yours?" Sakura shook her head slowly, hand coming to rest on the hilt of the damaged knife. "No. They're just tools. Like the blades you'd use to cut brush or rice, just people, instead." Fu made a thoughtful humming noise deep in his throat. "Cold," he said, "very cold. They might feel unloved like that." Sakura had no intention of naming the knives she'd taken from the body of a dead man. "That poison you used, what was it?" He grinned disarmingly, looking startlingly young again. "The secret behind the name reciprocity. The venom I gave you is extremely lethal, but almost painless. Neurotoxin, cardiotoxin. Mostly tingling in your fingers and progressive paralysis until your heart stops. Useful, but not much fun. What I use doesn't kill, just causes pain so extreme that it's debilitating. Pain for pain. I'll admit the source is a little less glamorous. The stonefish doesn't look like much, but stepping on it isn't a mistake you make more than once unless you're too stupid to live. And that's all I have for show and tell today, Oni-san." Fu sheathed the knife smoothly, then shuffled around behind Sakura so he could shoo her onward, back toward the fights. Sakura protested being hurted, but it didn't dissuade him at all, just made his eyes gleam with mischief as they emerged back onto the balcony just in time to see Rock Lee prove that his taijutsu was more than a match for the eerily familiar body manipulation used by Misumi. It didn't matter that the purple-clad genin seemed boneless in his flexibility. Lee's sheer speed made watching the match like watching a wasp kill a caterpillar. Sakura watched with admiration mingled with envy, because there was a smoothness and grace to his movements that she couldn't match even when she wasn't 5 days into a survival test. Perfect balance, excellent control, clear experience was in his every blow. Some part of her wondered what she looked like when she fought, given that all she seemed to do in training was run away from the Ninken and avoid Kakashi-sensei's projectile of the day. She glanced over, once, to where her teammates were standing, and found that knot behind her breastbone tightened. Naruto would have gotten them killed in the encounter with Orochimaru. Sasuke wouldn't respect her decision to surrender. In that moment, Sakura felt nothing but resentment for her team. So she turned away, taking the opportunity to glance over at the posted results for the matches she'd missed. Tenten had won her match and Shikamaru had won the one that followed against Kin. Then the next match was announced, which turned out to be the very definition of the term grudge. It was clear, despite a last-minute rally on Hinata's part, who was going to be the victor of that particular match. Sakura nearly choked on her anger as Naruto cheered her onward into cardiac arrest, Niji's deft and vicious mastery of their shared style not something that could be overcome by something as trite as Naruto's never say die philosophy. Her fingers clenched around the railing, which gave a metallic creak of protest that had Fu glancing over at her. She relaxed her grip, unclenched her jaw, and pretended that her increasingly instinctive use of chakra hadn't left indent ions of her fingers in a steel rail. But his curiosity turned to something else as 2 new names blinked into life on the display. Dosu no longer looked disoriented, though any subtlety of expression was lost behind his extensive bandages, but his opponent was the redhead from Suna that had been so unnerving during their brief encounter. It didn't help that Fu sucked in a breath and murmured, "Enter Sandman." What came next would be something that would be forever etched on her memory, because if there was an imbalance in skill between Niji and Hinata, the distance between Gaara and Dosa was a chasm. Dosa was not an incapable ninja, she admitted grudgingly as she watched him press forward, confident in his ninjutsu, but Gaara was a monster. He never moved, never seemed to breathe, hardly seemed to blink. Just stood there, sand dampening all Dosa's sound waves, and then all that sand reached out like the hand of a god and crushed Dosa. There was a short scream, Then blood was seeping through the sand, the crowd so silent she almost imagined she heard it dripping to the floor. Gaara didn't preen or gloat. He just released the lump of twisted flesh and broken bone to floor with a wet-sounding thump and walked away, rejoining his team as if this was just another exercise at the academy. As if he hadn't just slaughtered someone without ever lifting a hand. What made it bad was that not a flinch of surprise was displayed by his teammates or his Jounin-sensei, although she thought it might be disgust that twisted the kunoichi's lips into a grimace. But not like someone seeing someone terrible, like a housewife catching sight of a dirty floor. What made it worse was that Sakura's name was the next to be illuminated on the board. And her opponent was that kunoichi from Sand, who looked so composedly on the thing that until a minute ago had been a person. They had to wait for them to clean the floor, and even when it was pronounced fit for use, there was a fine layer bloody sand that they'd need to wash from the concrete later. Some part of her brain wondered if they had drains built into this floor for just this circumstance. The rest of her mind was considering what it might mean to lose to this kunoichi. The sand made a sound beneath her boots as she walked to take her place in the center of the floor, like a scritching, like something ugly crawling beneath the loam. Temari, that was her name, didn't have the smooth, glossy prettiness of a Konohagaku or kunoichi. She was hard, sharp, prickly, like the foliage native to Suna, which might have been its own kind of beauty. What it told Sakura was that this was someone else who also survived, and that this battle would be like the bridge, like the forest. And when Temari smirked, Sakura let any thought of losing intentionally slip away. She didn't know if she could win, but she wasn't going to end up like Dosa. And if that meant that Temari had to die, well, she could live with that. Kill your heroes. Chapter 19. Testophobia, Part 3. Temari opened her mouth and Sakura unsheathed her knives as the proctor's hand fell, darting forward before the final syllable fell silent. Temari's eyes widened slightly at Sakura's speed, but her blades never touched skin. In the time it took to cover the scant feet between them, the other kunoichi somehow managed to wedge that unwieldy length of metal she'd been wearing on her back between herself and Sakura. It was wide enough and long enough to protect her core, and Sakura snarled in frustration, because that familiar litany of larynx, spine, lungs, liver, jugular, subclavian artery, kidneys, heart might have been a to-do list like grocery shopping for Zabuza, but if her first strike failed, she would have to really work for her victory. And she was just so damn tired. A strange, shrieking snarl escaped her as she threw herself forward, hands pressed briefly together as her image flickered and splintered, producing 3 versions of Sakura. Temari's lips twisted into a fierce, competitive grimace as she flipped her fan open and swept it parallel to the floor in a waist-high sweep. Shearing winds extended the reach of sharpened steel ribs, and that invisible blade tore through all the visible Sakura clones, but the real one, invisible beneath Genjusta, slid beneath the blow, managing to unbalance Temari as her foot impacted her ankle. Sakura cursed herself, because she'd meant to sweep both her feet, but concrete was not conducive to sliding. The skin between her boots and shorts throbbed as the wound in her side screamed, but she ignored it as she tried to prise open Temari's defenses. Launching herself up from the floor, she thought she could take advantage of any counter-attack Temari might make, but counter to her expectations, Temari turned her stumble into a retreat. More cautious than her teammate, Sakura registered, more dependent on distance to keep the advantage. Dependence on her wind ninjutsu, rather than hand-to-hand skill. Sakura couldn't know it wasn't lack of skill, only reasonable caution. Temari was no fool. She'd seen Sakura when she'd come in, seen how quick she was to pull her knives, and came to the correct conclusion. This wasn't an opponent she'd let close on her. Temari sent another gust of wind roaring toward Sakura, and Sakura imagined it was like trying to stand against a hurricane blast. Little bits of dirt, grit, and debris scoured her skin, and only tenacity and chakra manipulation kept her upright. Her eyes watered, and it burned to breathe, but she only tucked in her chin, sheathed a knife, and pulled her shima cup over her nose, using chakra to keep it in place rather than freeing a hand to retie it. Then her knife was in her hand, and she was advancing like a 13-year cicada cycle, slow and ponderous, but inevitable. It was almost as bad as fighting beneath the bridge had been, because there was no point at which it was safe to have both feet off the floor. And that was more than just inconvenient when Temari's next blast of shearing wind was suddenly full of whirling shuriken that buzzed like enraged hornets. She had a microsecond to decide to hold ground, which would mean choosing what hits to take, or to fall back. Sakura chose to hold, contorting her body in such a way as to minimize her profile, the sharp bark of metal against metal marking the shuriken she struck out of the air. The rest dealt her only glancing wounds, which given their speed and sharpness, hardly hurt at all. Sakura lunged forward in the silent wake of the wind, Tamari's eyes widening as she slammed her fan shut, using it to block Sakura's strikes. And Sakura, with her double knives, had to swallow down a curse as their battle became a kind of high-stakes dance with a lightning-fast tempo. One good blow to the fan would be enough to ruin the edge of her knife forever. One good strike would be enough to end Tamari forever. She pressed harder, one of her knives catching a glancing blow on the flat that sent it spinning out of her hand. Sakura roared, empty hand curling into a fist and slamming against the barrier of the fan. The metal screeched in protest, buckling, but her hand was on fire with the dozen tiny breaks of a boxer's fracture. Tamari's eyes widened in incredulous disbelief, but kept up her defense as Sakura tried to press the advantage. In her determination to keep going despite the pain, she overlooked her own defense and a hard kick in the gut from Tamari sent her staggering back and she couldn't recover in time to keep herself from being clipped by another gust. It tore open a long gash on her arm, but these days Sakura had new standards for pain. So she just sheathed her knives and folded her fingers into an increasingly familiar set of signs, feeling the pulse of chakra that marked the hook of the hell viewing jutsu setting deep. As Tamari's eyes caught on the ghost a woman, Sakura's hands folded the second genjutsu, which rendered her invisible again because she too was an item in the environment, her hand unerringly traveling to Fu's gift, uncapping it and ever so carefully watching death drip onto the discolored steel of her remaining knife. It took only moments, the container capped again and tucked away, then she was sprinting forward, edging into that place where she was moving so fast she couldn't see. Perhaps she'd grown overconfident in the Magen, Narakumi no Jutsu. Kakashi-sensei had warned her once that the genjutsu provoked fear and horror and that some people reacted to that very differently. But there were dead men between that statement and this battle, men who'd frozen up and ceded that one necessary second. Tamari, somehow sensing her invisible rush, looked directly at her, her eyes wet with tears but burning in rage. Sakura's only comfort as the wide metal bat of Tamari's folded fan impacted against her skull was that she'd flipped her wrist around in time, opening a wide laceration down the other kunoichi's arm as she drew her weapon back for a second blow. If I'm dead, she thought fuzzily, so is she. Kill your heroes. Kakashi had internally winced at the sound of that long length of steel impacting his student's skull and he could only hope that second blow across her back hadn't shattered vertebrae. The Suna kunoichi sneered down at her, then took 2 steps back and glared expectantly at the proctor. He obligingly called the match, medics swarming toward Sakura and Kakashi stood up from his slouch against the wall, making his way down into the pit to make certain that his student would still be his student after some time with the medic nin. One of the medics glanced up at him as he drew close. What exactly have you been teaching your students, Heitake? He demanded. Kakashi had memorized the faces, if not the names, of all the medical personnel in the village, the better to elude them, so he wasn't surprised to recognize him. But he was surprised to recognize the expression on his face, which was one which normally only escaped when he thought Kakashi had done something terminally stupid on an Umbu mission. I have no idea what you mean, he said blithely. I mean your student is well on her way to a nice case of sepsis, so I have no idea what business you thought she had entering this match to start with. But I suppose you might be glad to know that aside from that and the nasty wound in her side that started it, a perforated eardrum, some major fractures in her hand, bone bruising across her shoulder blades, and a concussion, there's nothing much wrong with her. Well, that's comforting to know, Kakashi said after a significant pause, recalling how Sasuke had grabbed Sakura's hand. He suppressed a sigh and wondered bleakly if his team had been this much of a burden to Minato. Doubtful, he decided as he watched the medics load Sakura onto a stretcher. Is Sakura-chan going to be okay? Naruto asked anxiously as he returned to the balcony. Kakashi let his eyes trail over to Sasuke, who was listening intently and trying to disguise it by keeping his eyes on the pit. Unless I miss my guess, he said lightly, taking into consideration her decision to stand with a foreign nin, she's going to be very angry, but otherwise she's going to make a full recovery. Naruto's brows drew together. You mean about losing the fight? I mean, that was kind of... Kakashi held up a hand to forestall hearing whatever Naruto thought of the fight. We're going to talk about this later, he told both of his students. For now, concentrate on your matches. The next match saw Ino turn Zuko's need to gloat into a trap, his monologue as he held her by hair with his one functional arm more than enough time for her to snatch control of his body. The spirit of a Yamanaka might move slowly and only in straight lines, but at point-blank range. It was a matter of seconds to have his body surrender. Sasuke's name came up next in the draw, against Inyazuka Kiba, which wouldn't have worried him in the normal course of things. Except that the ugly chakra that crawled out of a seal and spilled across Sasuke's skin wasn't anywhere near the normal course, nor was Sasuke's grudging agreement to seal it. And because he was Hatake Kakashi and his life sometimes felt like some tragic farce, Orochimaru himself stepped out of the shadows and wanted to talk. It was like trying to tap dance in a minefield, talking with one of the most notorious ninja to have ever worn the leaf. A ninja who apparently had less than perfectly altruistic intentions toward one of his students. He'd known that having the last Uchiha on his team would mean protecting him and his Kekkei Genkai from those who'd like to possess it. He just hadn't anticipated that it was something that the first major threat would come from one of the Sannin. Kakashi didn't let himself relax when Orochimaru turned to leave, so he didn't tense when he paused and halfway turned back to him, those eerie yellow eyes focused on him again. Harano Sakurashi is a genjutsu type. Why should it matter? Kakashi countered warily. A swift smile. Curiosity. One shouldn't overlook unexpected treasures simply because they aren't what you set out to find. I expect it will be a difficult path for her. After all, so few role models to follow. So little you can teach her. So many other demands on your time. I wonder if anyone has told her that the two most recent genjutsu types of any note that this village has produced were Uchiha Itachi and myself? No. He asked when Kakashi kept silent. All ore is ugly. It only matters whether it's worth the effort to refine. If you can't be bothered, you should find someone who can. You? Kakashi asked tightly. That prompted that low, unsettling chuckle. Not me. Some animals are too dangerous to raise. And with that he was gone and Kakashi was left to wonder just what had happened in that forest. He scrubbed a hand through his hair and made his way back to the pit, crossing paths with the foreign nin who'd been standing with Sakura. The boy, hands hidden by his two long sleeves, was trying unsuccessfully to stifle his laughter. He glanced up at Kakashi as he passed in for the second time that day. He met citron eyes. He pulled his hands away from his mouth long enough to say, Oni-san bit her, before he dissolved into another fit of sniggering and disappeared down the hall. He emerged onto the balcony just in time to hear the Sunanin yelling for a medic. Their Kunoichi, the one who'd been Sakura's opponent not more than 20 minutes ago, had lost the ability to talk and was swiftly losing consciousness. Poison was the diagnosis of the attendant medic nin, who swept her out of the arena to the murmurs of the watching crowd. Just what the hell happened in that forest? That was the thought that occupied him throughout the rest of the exam, leaving him with just enough presence of mind to desultorily congratulate Naruto on his victory against Chuji and watch as Shino undermined the Suna puppet master's technique by the very simple, practical measure of setting his Kikaicho to feast on the chakra strings needed to manipulate the puppets and then setting them to devour chakra from the fingers up. By the time he was shoulder-deep in writhing beetles, the Sunanin had conceded the match. Kakashi waited impatiently for the matchup for the next section to be announced, and almost the instant they were finished, he herded his gen into the room the medic nin had placed Sakura for treatment. It seemed like it was time for a discussion. And if he had to make them sit vigil at Sakura's bedside until she was ready to participate in it, well, he was a little put out with all of them at the moment. Kill your heroes. Chapter 20. Allodoxophobia. Kakashi kept silent until Naruto was all but squirming in his seat, while Sasuke attempted to give some impression of alertness rather than wrung-out exhaustion. Kakashi-sensei, can I? He cut Naruto off. No. But I. No, Naruto. Took his business won't collapse if you don't get celebratory ramen. Instead, why don't you tell me a story, he prompted, keeping his tone that lightly mocking, unreadable calm that had served him well since his father had fallen from grace. Untouchable, it said without saying, indifferent. And mostly it was the truth. He'd stopped investing himself in people at the same time he'd stopped believing that heroes were infallible. Unfortunately, this team was different. He owed Minato and he'd promised Sarutobi and the Ninken were awfully fond of Sakura. Just thinking of it made him tired. A story, sensei? Naruto asked incredulously. Even Sasuke darted a disbelieving glance at him. Yes, a story. Unless it actually was raining blood while I wasn't looking and Sakura just happened to be caught in a sudden shower. In which case, feel free to keep silent. And, yes, Naruto, that is sarcasm. I'm not willing to wait for a written report. The two of you are going to tell me what happened in the forest. Naruto and Sasuke shared a glance and it was unsurprisingly his blonde charge who took the lead, Sasuke only interrupting when Naruto got carried away. Or when he'd been absent. And he'd been absent for things that made it difficult to keep up his expression of neutrality, and when Naruto re-entered the story, he stopped trying. Naruto, he interrupted the blonde, sounding out the syllables of his name with exacting preciseness. What made you think it was a good idea to charge ahead when your enemy is clearly more powerful than you are? Even if Sasuke'd given him the scroll, he wouldn't have let us go anyway, Naruto protested indignantly. I didn't ask about the scroll, Naruto. Sasuke could have burnt the scroll himself or pitched it. I don't care. I want to know why you thought it was acceptable to stay and fight at all. Naruto had that kicked dog look, the one that said he didn't understand what he was being scolded for, but Kakashi was in no mood to spare his feelings. We couldn't just run. I'm not a scaredy cat, Naruto said, looking inexplicably betrayed. And who knows if we could have even made it anyway. Kakashi's voice was hard, as sharp-edged as his kunai, when he spoke again. Naruto, there is a fine line between being a hero and being the fool who got everyone slaughtered because he couldn't tell the difference between a battle worth fighting and one that was over before it ever started. And you crossed it. There are reasons to fight losing battles, but you didn't have any of them. You weren't holding the line, you weren't making some noble martyr sacrifice for the cause, you weren't protecting anyone. Frankly, I don't even know what you were doing. Was it a pride thing? Here was your best opportunity for some one-upmanship, Sasuke, and you just couldn't resist driving it home that you were brave enough to fight and he wasn't? Explain it to me, so I can tell you to never do it again. Those that abandon their teammates are trash, Naruto, but a person who makes their teammates decide between abandoning them or facing a fight that's too much for them to handle. That's something worse than trash. I want you to think about how you'd have felt if Sakura died, or Sasuke, just because you thought you could go toe-to-toe with someone who you should have recognized as a major threat. A gamut of emotions had run across Naruto's expressive features: indignation, anger, guilt, and his eyes looked suspiciously shiny as he stared down at his clenched hands. Kakashi didn't feel even reflexive guilt. Thanks to the Kyuubi's regenerative properties, it was impossible that pain would teach Naruto caution. It was easy to be fearless when even fractured bones healed within the day, but it was likely that if he wasn't set right now, he'd assume that his teammates could take just as much punishment as he did with as little consequence. And Kakashi knew where that would lead. Courage had its place, but he knew exactly what overconfidence could cost a team. It was a measure of how seriously they were taking this that Sasuke wasn't smirking at Naruto, was instead staring very steadily at the rail of Sakura's hospital bed. He considered what he might say to him that he hadn't said already, but if Sasuke didn't already realize that Orochimaru was bad news and that probably needed to be in blazing capital letters, it would take more than just words to change his mind. But if he couldn't address Orochimaru, he could address the other issue. So, Sasuke, and he was satisfied to see the genin in question flinch almost imperceptibly, is there a reason that you wouldn't let Sakura forfeit? Sasuke wouldn't meet his eyes and he mumbled his response. What was that? Because I thought she could do it, Sasuke repeated, his words edged in irritation that likely came from embarrassment if the faint flush at the tips of his ears is anything to go by. And I didn't want to go into it with just the dead last. You didn't know she was hurt? Sasuke hesitated, then, I didn't think she was hurt that badly. She didn't say anything. When we were at the academy, you could always hear Sakura and Ino complaining if they got too roughed up during practical. And you didn't think that she might have matured since then? Kakashi asked dryly. Sasuke scowled and dropped his gaze. Not that much, he grumbled. She was always trying to get my attention. She should have said something. Kakashi remembered, vaguely, that the same someone who'd told him that there was a phase when girls would be more interested in boys than in training had also told him that that was the same time they started keeping secrets, and while they would outgrow the boys, they'd never outgrow the secrets. He was beginning to believe them. I'll give you one very good piece of advice about women, Sasuke. What they say out loud is only about 30% of the message. I like that you have confidence in Sakura's skills, but you might want to put a little bit more trust in her judgment. Especially as it relates to her own body. Naruto was staring at Sasuke. Wait, you stopped her from forfeiting? Back when Scary Lady in the fishnet stockings was giving the give up now speech. So? Sasuke retorted. Naruto's brows furrowed. I don't think Sakura should have given up then either, but it's kinda weird that you would even care. She's my teammate, Sasuke replied defensively. I'm your teammate. You're an idiot. Stop squabbling, Kakashi chided them. He was met with obedience and recalcitrant expressions, but both of them seemed subdued. Naruto rubbed at the back of his head in an awkward gesture, then asked, Hey, Kakashi-sensei. Yes. Did Sakura-chan, did she mean to poison Temari? How do you accidentally poison someone? Sasuke muttered scathingly. Let some people near a kitchen and you can find out, Kakashi thought, but kept it to himself. He didn't want to break the tone of this conversation, not when Naruto was taking it seriously. Kakashi considered downplaying the poisoning, but decided that enough was enough. This was like Sakura and Fire, all over again. If he didn't acclimate them now to the idea that their female teammate was their equal, it might burn them in live combat. They might be stronger physically, though Sakura was rapidly gaining ground, and would always be her better when it came to raw chakra, but she'd learned a very different lesson on that bridge than her two teammates. It put her in a very different place, emotionally and developmentally. That thought made him feel faintly guilty, but it wasn't a fresh, cutting guilt, just a resurgence of the old regret that poisoned everything. Just another person he'd failed to protect. There was a private memorial in his mind, one that he revisited in spirit when his body couldn't be at the one carved in unforgiving stone. Naruto, what did you think of Sakura's battle? Naruto hesitated, which told Kakashi that he hadn't been completely oblivious to the change in Sakura's behavior. For himself, the moment he'd seen her expression, he'd known exactly what was in store for the other Chunin candidate. And given what the Kunoichi's teammate had done, he didn't know that he'd have reacted any differently. Well, it was more aggressive than Sakura-chan usually is, Naruto said at last. The proctors all begin and Sakura's all like swoosh, and she's got those knives out. Where did she get those knives, anyhow? And she, looked kinda scary. Kinda like she wanted to kill Temari, he ventured hesitantly. There's no kinda. If we hadn't had medical staff on site, Temari would have died, Kakashi said flatly, deftly ignoring the question about the knives. He could see the struggle on Naruto's face as he tried to reconcile his Sakura-chan with someone who would make that kind of decision. Sasuke's expression was harder to read. Maybe she didn't know how bad the poison was. Naruto ventured hopefully. She was the one saying it was just a test. Sakura-chan wouldn't kill someone for that. Not for a test, but when someone's teammate slaughters someone in broad daylight for a test and your opponent doesn't flinch, that might be a good indication that she doesn't share your values system. And Sakura wasn't willing to die for a test either. She could have forfeited, Sasuke remarked. She could have. If she'd been thinking clearly, she might have, but from what the medic Nin told me, her fever was already bad going into the fight. When it's life or death, a kind of tunnel vision that only accepts one outcome isn't that unusual. Sakura wasn't going to die, so Temari had to. A harder edge crept into his voice. And, failing that, she was going to make certain no one survived. Why? Sasuke asked after a long, charged moment. That's not like Sakura at all. It is like Sakura, just not the Sakura you remember from the academy. Which she hasn't been. Not for a while. The two of you need to recognize that. Kill your heroes. Pain medication was good in the sense that without it the bruises the medic Nin had left to heal in their own good time throbbed enough to make her miserable, bad in the sense that it made thinking difficult, like her brain was functioning at half speed. Just fast enough to understand she was in trouble, not fast enough to produce excuses. But, grumpy and defensive, she didn't feel much like giving them either. She'd woken to only Kakashi-sensei in the room, though he'd remarked wryly that he'd made Sasuke and Naruto stay until Naruto had almost taken out some very expensive medical equipment when he'd toppled out of his chair. That was fine with Sakura. She didn't want them here, anyway. Her fingers clutched at the thin blanket as she tried to swallow down her anger. Poison is something new for you, Kakashi-sensei said in that light, leading way he had. They managed to save her, in case you're wondering. Sakura frowned, filled with a very peculiar dichotomy of feeling. One part of her was relieved, because the fight was over and no one had died. That part felt a little guilty, because in retrospect it was clearer that Temari hadn't intended to turn the match into a duel to the death. She'd had the chance and hadn't taken it, even though she'd still been caught in Sakura's genjutsu when she'd dealt that final blow. The rest of her was afraid. If it had ended with the match, it would have been one thing. But she'd used Fu's gift and Temari had survived. Now there was a primal part of her brain insisting that leaving enemies alive was a very, very bad thing and her world would not be safe and right again until she fixed the problem. Her hands trembled on her covers and her blood pressure spiked on her monitor, neither of which she noticed until Kakashi-sensei's voice cut through the tightening spiral of her thoughts. Sakura. Calm down. Her eyes met his one, hers wide and panicked, his narrow with intensity. Kakashi-sensei, she gasped through the tightness in her chest, what do I do? Do? About what? Temari. What if she? He held up a hand to forestall her. Stop. I think I know where you're going with that. And you need to stop. Take a deep breath. She did as he instructed and her trembling quieted a little. Temari is from Suna. And Suna, in our line of work, is synonymous with poison. It helps that every third animal and second plant in their territory is poisonous, which they've used to their advantage in the past and will continue to in the future. Her teammate is a puppet master whose every needle, blade, and odd projectile doesn't see the field without a good coating of something unpleasant. It also means she's unlikely to hold a grudge about your use of it. From the sound of it, she was more upset with herself for not noticing it immediately. Sakura's brows furrowed, trying to understand this alien point of view. How long did it take for her to notice it? A little less than 20 minutes. Venom doesn't work as well with open cuts, the blood flow means less of it gets into the bloodstream to do its business. And because your match ended immediately, her heart rate slowed as well, which gave her more time before the effects became noticeable. In the field, it might have worked regardless. With Black Mamba, you're unlikely to last more than 6 hours. And only about one of those conscious. Now, with that said, Black Mamba aren't native to Konohagakure and if it's a shopkeeper who sold it to you, someone is about to get their license revoked. Where did you get the venom? It was a gift, Sakura admitted. From someone I met in the forest. Kakashi's brow soared. And you used it? He told me what it was, Sakura said, staring down at her clenched hands. I knew what type of venom it was. And, what it did. I just didn't expect for it to take so long to work. So you chose to try to kill Temari? Yes, Sakura admitted softly. Because I thought she'd kill me if I didn't kill her first. All right, Kakashi-sensei said after an unnerving pause. She looked up at him disbelievingly. That's it, just all right. Sakura, he said patiently, every shinobi in that room had already signed a waiver that accepted the possibility that their match might end with them dead. You saw that in action when that Otonin went against Gaara. You were within your rights to make that decision. But you also have to live with that decision. As long as you do that, I won't say anything. You're a genin now, which means more freedom to make your own decisions. And I recommended you for Chunin, which would have seen you making decisions for a squad. I'm not your parent, nor am I one of your academy instructors. I am your mentor and you are a working professional. Unless your judgment endangers you or others or violates the code, I won't tell you whether you're right or wrong. Every shinobi has to draw their line in the sand, decide what they will and won't do to achieve an end. I guess that makes sense, Sakura said after a long pause. Kakashi-sensei chuckled. I'd hope so. Now, you're free to leave whenever you feel up to it. Naruto and Sasuke both won their rounds. She felt less about that than she probably should, but there was nothing even resembling jealousy inside her at the news, so we're not going to be meeting up for regular training. I'll be taking care of Sasuke's training personally, so someone else will be handling you and Naruto for the interim. He grinned, his eye shifting into the familiar crescent that boded ill for everyone. And, Sakura? Don't think that a few bruises gets you out of walking the Ninken. Check the description for the links to the author.